Late in the year, AD 14, a large package arrived in Ancyra, modern Ankara, the capital of the Roman province of Galatia Pamphylia in central Anatolia. It had been sent from Rome by the consuls, who still held the highest official rank of the state in name, though real power lay elsewhere. The message they carried informed the provincial governor that Augustus, the first princeps of Rome, had died and been consecrated among the gods. His will had been read aloud in the Senate, and it contained a record of his own deeds and the benefactions he had given to the Roman people from his personal wealth. This text, known as the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the deeds of the divine Augustus, had already been inscribed on bronze pillars set up before his mausoleum in Rome. Yet this seemed insufficient, as only those present in the capital could read it. The Senate therefore ordered that copies be sent to the provinces, one of which was enclosed for the governor of Galatia. What steps the governor first took to carry out the decree are uncertain. He may have called the citizens of Ancyra to gather in the theater or marketplace and arranged for the text to be read in Greek, so all could hear it. While such details remain speculative, it is clear that the governor went further. He had the words of the late ruler carved into stone so that they might endure. In Ancyra itself, the Res Gestae was inscribed in both Latin and Greek on the walls of the Temple of Roma and Augustus. This bilingual monument became known as the Monumentum Anciranum, later hailed by historians as the Queen of Inscriptions. The text was not a personal memoir, but a carefully crafted account designed to present Augustus as the foremost representative of the Roman people. He reminded his audience that at the age of 19, he had stepped suddenly into public life, acting on his own initiative and at his own expense. Revising the text in his 76th year, he still emphasized his unmatched position in the state, recalling the many offices and honors granted him by Senate and people, though often under pressure rather than freely given. He recorded his triumphs, conquests, and benefactions, claiming no one had equaled his achievements. Augustus boasted that he had extended Rome's dominion in every direction, while exercising restraint where annexation was not practical. Under his guidance, the empire reached a level of stability, prestige, and strength previously unknown. Tribes from the Caucasus, and even monarchs from India had sent envoys to honor him. The Senate, acknowledging his unique status, devised new honors: the title Augustus, laurel trees at the entrance to his home, and the civic crown. A golden shield displaying his virtues, valor, clemency, justice, and piety, was set up in the Curia Julia as a lasting reminder of the qualities that justified his supreme rank. He was ultimately acclaimed Pater Patriae, Father of the country, the final confirmation of his position as the first citizen of Rome. How the people of Galatia responded to this message is unknown. Much of it was already familiar, as they had long been reminded of Augustus' greatness through local decrees, statues, and festivals. Across the province, altars had been raised where citizens gathered each year to swear loyalty to him and his heirs, pledging to defend them even at the risk of their own lives. For nearly 4 decades, Augustus had appeared to them as a distant but unshakable ruler, one who demanded taxes but also delivered peace and stability, and who seemed elevated far above the condition of ordinary mortals. After Augustus' death, Romans reflected on the extraordinary position he had held: 13 times elected consul, 21 times acclaimed as imperator, and honored with distinctions created specifically for him. Yet a century later, the historian Tacitus dismissed such tributes as superficial. In his view, these titles and ceremonies represented mere appearances, while the reality of Augustus's career told a different story. Tacitus reminded his readers of the ruthless ambition of the young Octavian, who shifted loyalties in the political struggles of his youth, bribed soldiers to secure their allegiance, and obtained his first office under false pretenses by claiming to support the Republic. His true talents, Tacitus claimed, were marked by betrayal, duplicity toward rivals, and harshness toward citizens whenever it suited his drive for power. Through deception, he outmaneuvered even his closest allies, Mark Antony and Lepidus, with whom he had once joined forces to destroy the Republic. Peace followed his final victory, but it came at a heavy cost. Political opponents eliminated, countless soldiers lost in campaigns, and tragedies like the devastating defeat of Varus in the Teutoburg forest only 5 years before Augustus' death. To Tacitus, the image of the virtuous benefactor promoted in official accounts masked the reality of a power-hungry ruler whose methods were morally questionable. Yet, whether praised or condemned, all agreed that Augustus had been the dominant force in Rome for nearly 6 decades. From the moment of Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, he never stepped away from political life, and after 30 BC, no challenger emerged who could seriously threaten his authority. From then on, he shaped not only the politics of Rome, but also its cultural life. And by the time of his death, even his critics acknowledged that the Roman state had become inseparable from the monarchy he had created. Any attempt to dismantle that system would have meant civil war and perhaps the loss of Rome's supremacy in the Mediterranean, with no certainty that monarchy would not reappear in another form. In the end, the memory of the suffering and instability that had preceded his rule made most Romans willing to accept the permanence of the new order. The monarchy had been forged through conflict, experimentation, and compromise, and its very survival owed much to the exhaustion of a people determined never to relive the chaos of the past. The family of the man later known as Augustus came from Velitrae, a town southeast of Rome, at the base of the Alban Hills. His father, Gaius Octavius, was born there into the equestrian order, the social class just below the senators. Like many ambitious Italians of his time, he managed to rise into the Senate and join the ruling elite. After serving as praetor, he was appointed governor of Macedonia in 61 BC and won a victory over the Thracian Bessi, earning the title of imperator by acclamation. This success could have brought him a triumph in Rome and the chance to seek the consulship, but on his return journey, he died at Nola in Campania. Because of this, he never entered the inner circle of Rome's nobility, composed of families that had held the consulship. This setback proved less damaging for his descendants than it might have been. For years earlier, Gaius Octavius had married Atia, the niece of Julius Caesar. Though he never attained the consulship himself, this connection tied his family to an ancient patrician line, which still carried weight in Rome's tradition-bound society. That bond would change the course of history for their son. Gaius Octavius and Atia had 2 children, the younger born on September 23, 63 BC, also named Gaius Octavius. His father died when he was only 4, and his mother later married Lucius Marcius Philippus, consul in 56 BC. While this stepfather was influential, the figure who shaped the boy's future most profoundly was his great-uncle Julius Caesar. Caesar, who had no children of his own, looked to his great-nephews as heirs, Lucius Pinarius, Quintus Pedius, and the young Octavius. Like many Romans of high rank, Caesar thought in dynastic terms, seeking to pass his power and position within his own family. After defeating Pompey in 48 BC, he ruled Rome as dictator, and though no record survives of detailed plans for Octavius, He clearly intended him for a special role. In his will, dated September 13th, 45 BC, Caesar adopted Octavius as his son and named him principal heir, granting him 3/4 of his estate. The other great-nephews shared the remaining quarter. Along with this inheritance came responsibility, payments promised to Caesar's veterans, whose loyalty had secured his dominance. Though Caesar did not declare a direct successor, the adoption, the inheritance, and the honors already given to Octavius revealed his intentions. At the time, Caesar still believed he had more years to shape the future, but fate intervened. Neither he nor his young heir could have foreseen how quickly the provisions of that will would change the course of Roman history. When Julius Caesar was assassinated on March 15th, 44 BC, his young great-nephew Gaius Octavius was in Apollonia, a town in Macedonia. He had gone there to continue his studies and was also expecting to join Caesar on a planned campaign against the Parthians, for legions had already been sent ahead to prepare. News of the dictator's death reached him suddenly. Some of his companions urged him to take immediate command of the troops stationed in Macedonia, but Octavius, still unsure of his position, declined. At that moment he had no knowledge of Caesar's will or his own future role. Only upon returning to Italy did he learn that he was Caesar's principal heir, both in wealth and in political legacy, and from then on he resolved to assume that inheritance fully. At Brundisium, where soldiers were gathering for Caesar's planned expedition, Octavius was welcomed with enthusiasm. Emboldened by their support, he took his first independent steps in politics. He demanded access to the funds prepared for the Parthian War and even seized the tribute from Asia that had just arrived in Italy, though he had no legal authority to do so. Later, in his official record of achievements, he would claim truthfully that he had raised an army on his own initiative, but the claim that he had done so at his own expense was misleading. Without the resources he appropriated, he would never have succeeded. With this money, Octavius managed to win over some of Caesar's veterans in Campania and marched on Rome. He entered the capital on May 6th, accepting both Caesar's estate and his name, calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar. Though custom dictated that he adopt the surname Octavianus, he avoided it since it highlighted his less distinguished origins. Modern historians use Octavian for this period to distinguish him from his adoptive father, though contemporaries more often referred to him simply as the young Caesar. In the weeks after Caesar's assassination, political loyalties were unsettled. A general amnesty was proclaimed for the conspirators, while Caesar's existing decrees were upheld. Real authority lay with the two consuls, Mark Antony and Dolabella. Antony, older than Octavian by nearly 20 years and long close to Caesar, initially took the lead. His fiery speech at Caesar's funeral roused the crowd and forced the assassins from Rome despite the promise of amnesty. Yet his position remained insecure. He wavered between factions, failed to win over veterans and the plebs, and angered many when he resisted Caesar's deification, which was strongly desired by the populace. His attempts to secure new provinces for himself also appeared opportunistic, alienating members of Caesar's party. These missteps would open the way for Octavian's rise. Octavian quickly built support in Rome. He declared his intention to avenge Caesar's murder, fulfilling the Roman virtue of pietas, filial duty. He also paid out the 300 sesterces promised in Caesar's will to every citizen, something Antony had neglected to do, earning gratitude from the urban masses. In July, he personally organized the games in Caesar's honor, when the official priests hesitated. During those games, the sudden appearance of a comet was taken as a sign of Caesar's divinity. Octavian embraced the omen, adding the star to Caesar's statues and later stamping it on coins. These actions gained him immense popularity and transformed him from a youth of uncertain standing into a central figure in Roman politics. At the same time, Octavian was carefully building connections, reaching agreements with moderates in Caesar's faction, and even exploring contact with certain Republicans. Antony, who scornfully referred to him as the boy, tried to block his rise, but with only limited effect. Octavian's first march on Rome in late 44 BC, backed by veterans from Campania, did not succeed because the soldiers were unwilling to fight against other supporters of Caesar's cause. Still, the attempt unsettled Antony, who left Rome and summoned legions stationed near Brundisium, hoping to secure Gaul before Decimus Brutus's governorship ended. Yet 2 of Antony's legions defected, lured by Octavian's financial promises, and his retreat began to look like a flight. Lacking official authority, Octavian leaned on his role as Caesar's heir, presenting himself as duty-bound to act in his adoptive father's name. This unstable political climate gave him room to maneuver despite his youth. Though Caesar's party held a majority in the Senate, fear of Antony's aggressive tactics led many to side with the Republicans under Cicero. The Senate, however, lacked troops in Italy, as Brutus and Cassius were still in the east. Octavian filled that gap, offering his soldiers to the Senate in exchange for legitimacy. Cicero brokered the deal, and Octavian accepted even if it meant temporarily appearing to cooperate with Caesar's assassins. His priority was to secure a lawful basis for power. In January 43 BC, Octavian received imperium and entered the Senate with consular privileges. He also took command formally for the first time, marking the date with a sacrifice to present it as the beginning of a new era. The Senate also authorized the payments he had promised his soldiers, ensuring their continued loyalty. Soon after, Octavian marched north to Mutina, where Antony was besieging Decimus Brutus. The year's consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, both linked to Caesar's party, joined him. On April 21st, Antony was defeated, but both consuls were killed, leaving Octavian in possession of their armies and greatly increasing his strength. Meanwhile, the Senate recognized the positions Brutus and Cassius had illegally seized in Macedonia and Syria, a decision that undermined Octavian's status as their sole military partner. Although their distance limited their effectiveness, some senators even suggested that the young Caesar should be removed from the scene altogether. More pressing was Antony's recovery in Gaul, where he gained support from governors such as Asinius Pollio, Munatius Plancus, and Lepidus. Their combined forces were stronger than Octavian's, and they now claimed vengeance for Caesar's death as their cause. For Octavian, aligning with them was both ideologically consistent and politically necessary, but first he aimed to consolidate his own position. With both consuls dead, Octavian's soldiers pressed the Senate to make their commander consul and to fulfill the financial promises owed to them. The Senate, still hopeful that Brutus and Cassius could provide support, refused. In response, Octavian marched once more on Rome. This time he succeeded. On August 19th, 43 BC, he and his relative Quintus Pidius were elected consuls, a step made unavoidable by the presence of Octavian's legions in the city. He then passed a law establishing a special tribunal against Caesar's assassins, giving legal force to his vow of vengeance, and used state funds to pay the veterans the money still due under Caesar's will. With Antony's coalition looming in the north, Octavian wisely had the Senate repeal the decree branding Antony and his allies as enemies of the state, a tactical move that opened the way for negotiations. In October 43 BC, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus met near Bologna to decide their course. Their two chief aims were to avenge Caesar's murder and to secure their own dominance. Although they styled themselves Tresviri Re Publicae Constituende, a triumvirate charged with reordering the state, the arrangement was less a constitutional reform than a pact for power. Unlike the earlier private agreement between Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, this compact was given a legal veneer by approval of the People's Assembly. On November 27th, a plebiscite granted them official authority for 5 years. Their powers were almost absolute. Any decision they made carried the weight of law, and no one could legally oppose them. Resistance could now only take violent form, a grim sign for the future. The triumvirs began by dividing the Western Empire. Lepidus was assigned Gallia Narbonensis and Spain. Octavian received Sicily, Sardinia, and Africa, while Antony held on to Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, the most advantageous position militarily. Octavian's lot was weak by comparison, especially since Sextus Pompeius, son of Pompey the Great, still dominated the seas with his fleet. Africa, too, remained only a nominal possession, unless Octavian could seize it by force. Their next step was to turn east against Caesar's assassins. To maintain their armies, they required enormous sums, and to ensure their position at home, they needed to eliminate potential rivals. They revived Sulla's brutal device of proscriptions, lists of enemies declared outlaws, whose lives and property could be taken with impunity. Rewards were offered for their deaths, and their estates were confiscated and sold to enrich the triumvirs. Around 300 senators and 2,000 knights were marked for destruction. Octavian is said to have resisted at first, mainly in an effort to spare Cicero, but Antony's hatred of the orator prevailed. Whatever his hesitation, Octavian soon shared responsibility for ruthless measures. Only later in life would he promote clementia, Caesar's policy of mercy, as a political virtue. The proscriptions devastated Rome's old elite. Entire senatorial families were wiped out, and their places filled with men loyal to the triumvirs, often soldiers who took over the wealth of those they replaced. City councils, too, were purged and reshaped. Though society's structures endured, the political order was transformed. Republican traditions were so damaged that they could not recover. One historian later called this upheaval a Roman Revolution, as it created the framework on which Augustus would build. Despite this, the hoped-for financial windfall was disappointing, and special taxes had to be imposed. Meanwhile, Brutus and Cassius had raised 19 legions in the east, financed by harsh levies on local populations and supported by allied rulers. Many Republican sympathizers, including the poet Horace, joined them. The triumvirs assembled 28 legions and moved them to Macedonia, seeking a decisive confrontation before the Republican fleet could cut off their return to Italy. The showdown came at Philippi in October 42 BC. 2 battles were fought, both ultimately decided by Antony. Octavian's role was less glorious. Later, Antony mocked him as a coward who had fled in the fighting, and it is clear that he struggled with the strain of direct command. In time, he would entrust field leadership to trusted generals like Marcus Agrippa. Yet what mattered was the result. The Republicans were crushed. Brutus and Cassius fell, their cause destroyed. Brutus' head was displayed in Rome as proof of victory. Sextus Pompeius, controlling the western seas, could not replace the fallen leaders. The triumvirs now stood unchallenged, ready once more to divide the Roman world among themselves. Antony retained his hold over Gaul, which gave him a secure military base, but he was expected to move east to stabilize the region and raise funds for the payment of veterans. At first, his mission seemed manageable. Octavian, meanwhile, was granted Spain, a concession made by Antony at the expense of Lepidus. Yet Octavian's immediate task was far more difficult. He had to find land for the tens of thousands of veterans promised discharge after Philippi. Even those who had fought on the Republican side needed to be resettled, since leaving them free to wander would risk their being recruited by another ambitious leader. At this time, Italy was still regarded as the primary place for such settlements. Although Caesar had experimented with settling soldiers in the provinces, the practice was not yet widely accepted. Since Italy had no remaining public land, Octavian could only meet the demand by confiscating private property. This decision had explosive consequences. At least 18 Italian towns were affected, some losing all their inhabitants, others suffering partial evictions. The anger of the dispossessed spread across the countryside. A few exceptions were made, such as in the case of the poet Virgil, who, through the intervention of Asinius Pollio, managed to keep his family estate near Mantua. He later expressed his gratitude in verse. Most citizens, however, cursed Octavian, even though they lacked the means to resist. Despite the bitterness, Octavian's policy created a powerful bond with the veterans who received land, ensuring their loyalty and giving him a strong following in Italy itself, the heart of Roman power. The unrest soon turned into armed opposition. Lucius Antonius, Mark Antony's brother, emerged as a leader of the dispossessed and drew support from many senators. Whether or not Mark Antony was directly involved is unclear, but the movement gained considerable strength. To the Senate, Antony, now far away in the east, seemed less of a threat than Octavian, whose ruthless methods alarmed even his allies. Attempts were made to declare him an enemy of the state and to dissolve the triumvirate, but this was impossible. Too many soldiers depended on the triumvirs for their livelihood, and to break the arrangement would have risked alienating the very veterans on whom Roman stability now depended. Octavian moved quickly. Lucius Antonius and his allies withdrew to the fortified city of Perugia, where Octavian laid siege. Early in 40 BC, the town surrendered. Lucius was spared for the sake of his powerful brother, but Octavian punished others harshly. Many of the inhabitants were massacred, and it was reported that 300 senators and knights were executed on March 15th, the anniversary of Caesar's assassination, at an altar dedicated to Caesar himself. This act stained Octavian's reputation, and poets such as Propertius condemned him for it. Although victorious, Octavian gained little immediate security. Many of Antony's supporters who survived Perugia fled eastward to seek his intervention. Alarmed by Octavian's dominance in Italy, Antony turned his focus back west, even though the Parthians were advancing dangerously in Syria and Asia Minor. He now sought an alliance with Sextus Pompeius, who controlled the western seas, with the aim of curbing Octavian's power. The irony was sharp. Antony, one of Caesar's closest men, joined forces with the son of Caesar's great rival. But Roman politics at the time placed victory above loyalty or consistency. Octavian, for his part, was equally pragmatic. In 40 BC, he married Scribonia, the daughter of Scribonius Libo, a follower and relative by marriage of Sextus Pompeius, hoping to build ties of his own. The union lasted barely a year, but it produced his only child, Julia, who would later play a prominent but ultimately tragic role in Roman politics. In 40 BC, Antony returned to Italy at the head of a large force, but his presence did not lead to decisive conflict. He besieged Brundisium, where Octavian's troops were stationed, yet once again the soldiers refused to fight one another, guided by their centurions. These officers had grown increasingly influential as they held sway over the loyalty of their men, and their reluctance forced the rival leaders to negotiate instead of battle. That autumn, Antony and Octavian reached an agreement known as the Treaty of Brundisium, which ultimately worked to Octavian's advantage. While Africa was handed over to Lepidus, Octavian secured all the western provinces, leaving Antony with the eastern half of the empire. The treaty also declared Italy open to both sides for military recruitment, though in reality, this clause favored Octavian. Antony, by focusing on the right to recruit without recognizing the deeper implications, left Italy under Octavian's control. When Antony departed once more for the east, the balance of power in Italy effectively belonged to Octavian alone. The pact was sealed in dynastic fashion. Antony, recently widowed, married Octavia, Octavian's sister, who was herself a widow of Claudius Marcellus. The wedding in Rome was celebrated with great splendor. Octavia's life, and that of her children from both marriages, became closely tied to the political fortunes of her brother and her new husband. Whether she acted chiefly as a mediator between the two men or became more of a casualty in their rivalry remains difficult to judge. The Treaty of Brundisium failed to bring lasting peace to Italy. Despite Virgil's poetic vision of a golden age in his fourth eclogue, Sextus Pompeius still dominated the seas, disrupting grain supplies and threatening famine. Styling himself son of Neptune, he used his naval power to blockade Italy, forcing Octavian to negotiate. Under pressure, Octavian, with Antony's consent, concluded the Treaty of Misenum in 39 BC. Pompeius was granted recognition and control over Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, and the Peloponnese, and was promised the consulship for 35. In return, he lifted the blockade and restored the grain supply. The treaty also allowed many of his followers, survivors of the proscriptions or exiles from the civil wars, to return. Among them was Tiberius Claudius Nero and his wife, Livia Drusilla, who came from a distinguished Claudian line. Octavian was quick to notice Livia's political value, but personal desire was just as strong. He fell deeply in love with her. Though she was pregnant at the time, Octavian obtained special dispensation from the pontiffs to marry her. The wedding took place on January 17th, 38 BC. Livia soon gave birth to her second son, Drusus, while her elder child, Tiberius, was already 4. Both were later raised in Octavian's household after their father's death. The match strengthened Octavian's ties to the old aristocracy, while also binding his future to the Claudian line. Ironically, decades later, Tiberius would inherit the empire that Octavian had built. Even strengthened by marriage, Octavian did not long respect the terms of Misenum. The recognition of Pompeius's power cramped his ambitions, and Antony had little interest in helping to remove Pompeius, since his presence kept Octavian in check. Octavian therefore prepared for confrontation. One of Pompeius's officers betrayed him, handing over Corsica and Sardinia, but Pompeius's power remained formidable. To meet the challenge, Octavian entrusted Agrippa with building a new fleet, using innovative training and tactics. At the same time, Antony, facing his own problems in the east, agreed to cooperate. The two men met at Tarentum in 37 BC to renew the triumvirate, which had expired at the end of 38. The pact extended their alliance for another 5 years. Octavian had it formally ratified by the Assembly of the People, styling himself triumvir for the second time, presenting himself as acting within the Republic's framework. Antony, less concerned with appearances, dispensed with such gestures. Lepidus, though still nominally part of the triumvirate, played no significant role. By the agreement, Antony provided Octavian with 120 ships for the war against Pompeius, while Octavian promised 20,000 legionaries for Antony's eastern campaign. Antony delivered his ships promptly, but Octavian later sent only a fraction of the promised troops, a deliberate provocation that sowed future conflict. For the moment, however, their arrangement held. Octavian turned his full attention to Sicily, determined to destroy Pompeius. He framed the campaign as a war against pirates, though everyone knew it was another phase of civil war. In 36 BC, with Lepidus marching from Africa and Octavian narrowly escaping setbacks, Agrippa finally crushed Pompeius's fleet in 2 decisive naval victories at Mylae in August and at Naulokos on September 3rd. Defeated, Pompeius fled east, where he lingered as a problem for Antony until 35 BC, when he was captured at Miletus and executed by one of Antony's generals. After the defeat of Sextus Pompeius, some of his troops on Sicily surrendered to Octavian, while others gave themselves up to Lepidus. Emboldened by this, Lepidus demanded control of the entire island. But he miscalculated, for Octavian had long since mastered the art of swaying soldiers to his side, most often through promises of pay and rewards. Once again, large numbers defected to him, forcing Lepidus to yield. His life was spared, but he was stripped of power and confined to a villa at Cape Circe between Rome and Naples. The only position he retained was that of Pontifex Maximus, the head of Rome's religious college, a lifetime office that Octavian respected even for an enemy. Lepidus lived on without political influence until his death in 12 BC, his existence so carefully obscured that Rome all but forgot him. Officially, the triumvirate had collapsed, though Octavian and Antony continued to use the title without hesitation. Octavian also made a dramatic gesture to property owners in Italy. Tens of thousands of runaway slaves had flocked to Pompeius and served in his forces. Once captured, more than 30,000 were returned to their masters, underscoring the principle that only owners had the right to dispose of their property. But for 6,000 whose masters could not be identified, Octavian ordered mass crucifixion, one of the most brutal acts of the period. Free men who had supported Pompeius, especially officers, were offered clemency, but the cruelty shown to the slaves was unmistakable. At the same time, Octavian had to address the demands of his own soldiers. Veterans expected land and rewards, and this time he chose to settle many outside Italy, particularly in Sicily and southern Gaul, easing pressure on Italian landowners and signaling his intent to end the cycle of confiscations that had embittered so many. Though he declared the start of peace, true stability would not come for years. When Octavian returned to Rome, he was honored with an ovatio, a small triumph, since the campaign had been officially described as a victory over pirates. Following tradition, he waited outside the city until the Senate came to meet him, and once inside declared the civil wars at an end. To secure his position further, he received tribunician immunity, sacrosanctitas, protection normally reserved for tribunes of the plebs who represented the people. This privilege foreshadowed the formal tribunician powers he would later hold as Augustus, a cornerstone of his authority. Soon after, both Livia and Octavia were granted the same protection, marking the first step toward elevating the ruler's family as a symbol of the Roman people itself. While Octavian dominated affairs in the West, Antony still commanded the East, where he enjoyed strong support among senators and others in Italy as well. Being far away, he was less directly blamed for the harshness and instability that plagued Roman politics. Octavian, ever present in Rome, absorbed the anger of the old aristocracy, who resented his growing power. To strengthen his base, he arranged for many new men from Italian towns to be elected as quaestors, tribunes, aediles, and praetors. thereby swelling the Senate with individuals who owed their careers to him. Most of them proved loyal. Antony's absence limited his ability to respond, though the agreement from Brundisium, which ensured consular offices were divided evenly between the factions, still held. Octavian, despite his many maneuvers, left this arrangement intact, while steadily building a Senate more favorable to his cause. At this stage, Antony, whether through misfortune or miscalculation, strengthened Octavian's hand, though it must be remembered that the surviving accounts were shaped by Octavian's eventual victory and his influence over the historical record. Even so, Antony himself provided enough grounds for criticism. While Octavian was securing triumphs in the West, Antony suffered a disastrous failure in his Parthian campaign. His goal had been to win glory, recover the standards lost by Crassus, and secure new territories and riches. Instead, he endured heavy losses of men and equipment, returning in disgrace. At first, he attempted to conceal the scale of the disaster by sending reports of victory, which were even celebrated in Rome with thanksgiving ceremonies. When the truth emerged, it was a devastating blow to his reputation, particularly among the veterans in Italy. Octavian then delivered a calculated insult. In fulfillment of the Tarentum agreement, Antony had been promised 20,000 legionaries. Instead, Octavian sent only 2,000, along with Antony's wife, Octavia, who brought the troops to him in the east. Antony now faced a painful choice. His diminished forces could only be restored with the help of Cleopatra, who possessed the resources of Egypt and with whom he already had children. Yet accepting her aid meant sending Octavia back to Rome. Military necessity and personal passion both pointed him toward Cleopatra, and so he dismissed his wife. This gave Octavian the perfect pretext for propaganda. Antony had rejected a Roman wife and the sister of his colleague in favor of a foreign queen. The scandal was too useful to ignore. Octavian's camp portrayed Antony as enslaved to an exotic mistress, while the Senate and the Roman people found it difficult to defend him. Matters worsened in 34 BC, when Roman troops captured Armenia, and Antony bestowed the crown of that kingdom on his son by Cleopatra, Alexander Helios, while granting Cleopatra the title Queen of Kings. These gestures, echoing the Persian King of Kings, allowed Octavian to argue that Antony was betraying Rome's supremacy and diminishing its honor by placing conquered lands under the rule of a foreign queen's child. Antony went further, formally recognizing Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, as the natural son of Julius Caesar. This was a direct affront to Octavian, who had carefully built his position on being the divi filius, the adopted son of the deified Caesar. By acknowledging Caesarion, Antony appeared to challenge Octavian's legitimacy as heir to Caesar's legacy. The exchanges between the rivals hardened their enmity and left no room for compromise. Each provocation fueled the determination to settle the struggle by force. The war of words and propaganda was already underway. The clash of arms was now inevitable. On the first day of 33 BC, Octavian assumed the consulship once more and immediately launched a fierce attack in the Senate against Antony's distribution of lands and honors in the East, accusing him of betraying Roman interests. Antony, hearing of this while on campaign in Armenia, abandoned his renewed efforts against the Parthians, an expedition meant to erase the shame of his earlier defeat, and instead prepared for confrontation. Convinced that Octavian might conspire with foreign rulers or undermine his influence among client kings, Antony summoned his army and fleet to Ephesus and called upon the resources of Egypt and allied dynasties. Octavian, meanwhile, blocked any attempt by Antony to recruit in Italy, despite the agreement at Tarentum that had granted both men this right. In practice, the treaties no longer mattered. What mattered was who could seize supreme power. Octavian had been preparing for such a clash for years, even using his campaigns in Illyricum from 35 to 33 as training for his troops and as a chance to showcase himself as a commander. A wound suffered during a siege was even used in propaganda to counter Antony's charges of cowardice. Agrippa had rebuilt the fleet after the victory at Naulokos, since it was widely assumed that the next decisive contest would be fought at sea. Above all, Octavian and Agrippa sought to ensure that Antony could not cross the Adriatic and bring war into Italy again. Although Antony had begun his preparations in 33, the final rupture came only in 32. He may have hoped to strengthen his military position or to use propaganda more effectively, since his allies Gaius Sosius and Domitius Ahenobarbus were to serve as consuls that year. It is also possible that Antony counted on the expiration of the triumvirate at the end of 33 to weaken Octavian's authority in Rome, where legality and the will of the people carried weight. On January 1st, Sosius opened the Senate with a sharp attack on Octavian. His words swayed many senators, forcing Octavian to retaliate by appearing at the next meeting flanked by armed guards. He promised to present proof of Antony's treachery, though at that moment he had none to offer. The intimidation was effective, but also inflammatory. The two consuls abandoned the city and defected to Antony, joined by more than 300 senators, many of them from ancient republican families. For these men, Antony, even allied with Cleopatra and ruling autocratically in the east, seemed preferable to Octavian, whose relentless pursuit of power had already aroused deep mistrust. Some of them would later regret their decision, but by then their choice was sealed. For the moment, Antony's standing rose, bolstered by this group of exiled senators who gave his cause a semblance of legitimacy. He claimed to be defending republican liberty, which in practice meant the senators' right to speak freely. Modern historians have sometimes described Octavian's actions in this episode as a coup d'état, given his use of armed force in the Senate. Yet the legal situation was murky. It is uncertain whether the triumvirate had formally lapsed, and Antony himself still styled himself as triumvir on his coinage. In the end, legality was no more than a weapon in the struggle. Both men treated it as a tool, and in that struggle only victory would matter. Octavian finally obtained the evidence he had promised the Senate after so many senators defected to Antony. When these men reached the east, they found Antony openly living with Cleopatra, who had accompanied him to Athens from Ephesus. The pair surrounded themselves with the full splendor of a Hellenistic court, and Cleopatra persuaded Antony to repudiate Octavia. Whether they formally married remains uncertain, but the appearance of her influence over Roman affairs disturbed many of Antony's followers. To them, Octavian's claim that Cleopatra set herself against Rome's Jupiter did not seem mere rhetoric. The spectacle of senators forced to take orders from an Egyptian queen raised doubts about their own status as leaders of the Republic. Some of Antony's most loyal supporters, such as Munatius Plancus and his nephew Marcus Titius, abandoned him in the autumn of 32 BC. Their defection handed Octavian the advantage. Plancus revealed to Octavian the contents of Antony's will, which he had witnessed and signed. The original document, he said, was kept with the Vestal Virgins in Rome. According to Plancus, Antony had requested burial beside Cleopatra in Alexandria and had assigned conquered Roman lands as kingdoms for his children with her. For Romans, these provisions confirmed betrayal. Antony had forsaken his homeland and subordinated himself to a foreign queen. Octavian moved swiftly. He forced the Vestals to surrender the will, read its contents aloud in the Senate, and declared Antony no longer truly Roman. Whether he presented the full text is uncertain, but what he revealed was enough to destroy his rival's standing. With this proof in hand, Octavian persuaded the Senate to strip Antony of his powers, including his consulship for 31. Yet the declaration of war was not directed against Antony himself, but against Cleopatra, whose armies were officially described as the real threat to Rome. This careful framing avoided the stigma of civil war, which Octavian had earlier proclaimed was finished after the defeat of Sextus Pompeius. In reality, everyone knew the coming conflict was another Roman civil war, but it was politically expedient to blame Cleopatra. Octavian now portrayed himself as the chosen leader of the Roman people. He claimed that all of Italy stood behind him, that citizens swore loyalty oaths, and that the western provinces, Gaul, Hispania, Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia, had pledged their support. The East remained uncertain, but that would change after Actium. Even so, the loyalty was not as voluntary as Octavian later suggested. Veterans, many of whom had received land and payments through his policies, dominated local councils and pressured their communities to stand with him. At the same time, Octavian imposed a levy requiring Italians to contribute a quarter of their annual income to fund the war. The measure provoked unrest, but it was suppressed, and the seized funds went directly to the soldiers. What Octavian had once endured as the ungrateful task of settling veterans now turned into the very foundation of his political and military strength. In 33 BC, Agrippa, though already a former consul, served as aedile and won broad support among the Roman people by improving daily life in the city. He oversaw the construction of 2 new aqueducts, the Aqua Virgo and Aqua Julia, and placed fountains across Rome, ensuring cleaner water for drinking, bathing, and sanitation. Such works mattered as much as the grain supply in securing loyalty from the plebs, and they strengthened Octavian's position in the growing conflict with Antony. Propaganda framed the struggle as one between a loyal Roman tied by blood and tradition to the Republic, and a corrupted rival who sought to enthrone a foreign queen, bringing with her the trappings of Eastern decadence. To underline his Roman identity, Octavian began constructing a grand mausoleum for himself on the Campus Martius, in sharp contrast to Antony's wish to be buried in Alexandria. The declaration of war against Cleopatra was staged with equal attention to tradition. Octavian, acting as official priest, hurled a ritual spear into symbolic enemy ground in Rome. Antony, for his part, hoped to draw the war into Italy, but Octavian and Agrippa ensured that would not happen. Early in 31 BC, they ferried their troops across the Adriatic unopposed. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces at the Gulf of Ambracia, but Agrippa quickly seized key positions, cutting them off from supply lines. Octavian advanced south from Corcyra, hemming them in by land while Agrippa's fleet trapped them at sea. Antony repeatedly tried to force a land battle, but Octavian simply waited, letting time wear his opponent down. Desertions grew daily, while the blockade spread disease and hunger through the camp. Several Eastern kings abandoned Cleopatra's coalition, and the defection of Domitius Ahenobarbus, Antony's long-standing ally, struck a heavy blow. Even Antony's senators began to slip away, unwilling to tie their fate to Cleopatra's influence. As conditions worsened, Antony faced the collapse of his options. His decision to fight at Actium was not aimed at victory, but at escape. His ships carried sails, unsuitable for close combat, but useful for breaking out. On September 2nd, 31 BC, the fleets clashed. Agrippa's smaller, more agile ships outmaneuvered Antony's cumbersome vessels, trapping them in tight waters. In the midst of battle, Cleopatra forced her way through with her fleet, and Antony followed her retreat. The rest of his forces soon surrendered, but only after Octavian offered them favorable terms, including generous discharge payments. This calculated clemency secured their loyalty and reinforced his image as a leader of restraint and foresight. The triumph was credited to Apollo of Actium, the god of the nearby island of Leucas. Octavian fulfilled his earlier vow to dedicate a temple to Apollo on the Palatine Hill, and on the site of his camp, he founded the city of Nicopolis, the city of victory. A monumental altar honored Neptune, Mars, and Apollo Actiacus, and recurring games every 4 years commemorated the great turning point. Actium thus became not only a decisive military triumph, but also a carefully staged symbol of divine favor and Roman destiny. After Actium, Antony and Cleopatra made one final attempt to resist in Egypt. On August 1st, 30 BC, Octavian's army crushed their forces near Alexandria. Facing defeat, Antony fell on his sword and died in Cleopatra's arms. Octavian sought to take the queen alive to display her in a Roman triumph, but she denied him that satisfaction by ending her life with the bite of a venomous serpent. Her dramatic suicide left a lasting impression, even earning respect from the poet Horace, who otherwise celebrated Rome's victory. Though Octavian lost the chance to parade Cleopatra as a captive, he had more than enough reward. He stood as sole master of the Roman world, and Egypt, with its immense wealth, was now firmly in his grasp. The treasures of the Ptolemaic dynasty, seized after Cleopatra's death, together with Egypt's revenues as a newly annexed province and the spoils of war, gave Octavian the means to reward his supporters on an extraordinary scale. In August of 29 BC, Rome witnessed an unprecedented 3-day triumph, celebrating his victories in Illyricum, Actium, and Alexandria. These ceremonies also proclaimed the end of the long civil wars that had begun with Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon. 2 decades of bloodshed had devastated the Republic, leaving ancient families destroyed and clearing the way for a new political order dominated by men whose ties to the old traditions were weak at best. What united Romans now was the yearning for peace. Exhausted and willing to accept profound change, they welcomed Octavian's act of closing the Temple of Janus Quirinus in 29 BC, a ritual symbol that peace had been restored throughout the empire. The gesture announced the dawn of a new age. Yet beneath the celebration lay the pressing questions that remained unresolved. What structure would replace the shattered republic, and what role would Octavian himself claim within it? Only once these matters were settled could the new era, a new saeculum, truly begin. In the early 3rd century, the Greek historian Cassius Dio, himself a senator, recorded in his Roman history a debate he claimed took place before Octavian in 29 BC. The speakers were Agrippa, who had won the decisive battles that left Octavian master of Rome, and Maecenas, an educated statesman of Etruscan noble descent who preferred to act behind the scenes but was entrusted by Octavian with delicate and vital tasks. According to Dio, Agrippa argued in favor of restoring the Republic, which would have meant Octavian giving up the power he had secured. Maecenas, by contrast, advised an open monarchy and outlined wide-ranging reforms, including changes to the Senate, offices of state, the army, taxation, and the law. In reality, these speeches were not delivered in such form. Dio's account reflects later hindsight, incorporating developments that only unfolded over the following centuries. Still, his fictionalized exchange captures an important truth. After Actium, Octavian and his closest circle must have debated intensely how to establish a permanent system of government that preserved his authority while appearing legitimate. Former opponents, many resigned to the new reality, watched carefully to see what would emerge under Rome's sole ruler. These discussions left no public record. Decisions were shaped in private, far removed from the open debates that had once characterized the Senate and popular assemblies. Only their outcomes were revealed, leaving us to speculate about the reasoning behind them. Two principles guided Octavian and his allies. First, he had no intention of relinquishing the power he had fought so hard to obtain. The Caesarian faction, which had shared in his victory, also expected rewards and influence. Second, Julius Caesar's model of outright monarchy had proven dangerous. It had led directly to his assassination. After decades of turmoil, Romans were more willing to tolerate a single ruler, but few wanted an open rejection of republican traditions. Even Octavian's own supporters were more comfortable within a framework that resembled the old order, in which they could envision their future roles. A completely new system would have brought too much uncertainty. Thus, the decision was made to restore the Republic in name, while reshaping it in practice. The crisis years of the late Republic had already produced precedents, emergency powers and extraordinary commands for figures like Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, which stretched constitutional limits but were nonetheless sanctioned by Senate and people. These precedents could now serve to anchor Octavian's authority in legality. The key was timing. To present the return of the Republic and the consolidation of Octavian's rule as natural and complementary. The years after Antony's defeat were devoted to crafting this moment. Octavian was honored as the bringer of peace, and a series of public gestures elevated his status. His name was added to prayers and vows in state rituals, even in the ancient hymn of the Salians. His birthday and the anniversary of Actium became holidays. Households were told to include sacrifices to his genius in their private devotions. The long-neglected rite of the Augurium Salutis, a prayer for the safety of the state, was revived, linking the prosperity of Rome directly to him. These measures, blending genuine reverence with political calculation, raised Octavian above ordinary men and made his person appear essential to the survival and flourishing of the Roman state. In the aftermath of years of chaos, Octavian began presenting himself as the restorer of order and tradition. He emphasized in his Res Gestae that 82 temples and shrines had been repaired under his direction, a visible sign that Rome's relationship with the gods had been renewed. For the first time in 4 decades, a census was carried out, recording over 4 million Roman citizens, 4 times the number counted in 69 BC. Evidence, he claimed, of Rome's vitality. In 30 BC, he was also granted the privilege of elevating new families to the patrician order, a necessity since so many had been wiped out in the civil wars. Only patricians could fill certain sacred offices, and those roles were seen as essential to the well-being of the state. Octavian filled these ranks with his supporters, reinforcing his political base. Then, in 28 BC, he issued a sweeping decree voiding the emergency measures passed illegally during the wars. In practice, this did little to weaken his authority, but it freed him from earlier promises and enhanced his image as the man who had restored legality. This move marked a key stage in the so-called restoration of the Republic, which, as Augustus himself would later stress in his Res Gestae, occurred during his 6th and 7th consulships in 28 and 27 BC. It was a gradual process rather than the dramatic, compressed episode described by Cassius Dio. A gold coin from his 6th consulship even proclaimed that he had returned jura et leges, laws and statutes, to the Roman people, signaling the revival of elections and courts, at least in appearance. The final stage came in January 27 BC, when Octavian staged the formal renunciation of extraordinary powers. He surrendered his sweeping control of the provinces and the armies stationed there, a dramatic gesture after having held absolute authority through the unanimous consent of all. Yet this return of power was only partial. Octavian remained consul, holding the most influential office in the state, and retained unparalleled wealth, prestige, and above all the loyalty of soldiers and veterans across the empire. Everyone knew he had no real intention of stepping aside. Senators, many of whom had been carefully prepared, played their part by urging him to reconsider. They reminded him that Rome's peace and safety were his achievement, that the gods themselves had marked him out as protector of the state, and that the people would fall back into chaos without his leadership. Octavian, naturally, refused at first, insisting on his wish to withdraw. But little by little he yielded, agreeing at last to retain control over those provinces still unsettled. The areas placed under his authority, Spain, Gaul, Syria, Cilicia, Cyprus, and Egypt, covered much of the empire and, not coincidentally, echoed the territories once divided between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus in the 50s BC. Now they were united under a single command. Even so, Octavian carefully avoided presenting this as monarchy. His tenure was fixed at 10 years, with a promise to return any pacified province to the Senate before that period expired. In this way, immense personal power was cloaked in the forms of republican legality, setting the foundation for a new political order that was neither openly a kingship nor a true restoration of the old republic. Octavian's decision to retain command over certain provinces was driven less by the territories themselves than by the legions stationed within them. Although these troops did not represent the entire Roman army, they formed the bulk of its strength. Other legions were based in Illyricum, Macedonia, Pamphylia, and Africa, regions classified as provinces of the Roman people. But the majority now fell under Octavian's authority, which had always been his central objective. He did not require any new office or extraordinary commission to legitimize this control, since as consul his imperium already granted him the authority to govern provinces and command troops, just as in the Republican era. Later, historians, such as Cassius Dio, claimed he was also given proconsular imperium, but this is more a reflection of their misunderstanding of early imperial arrangements than of the actual circumstances. In practice, Octavian relied on his consular powers to secure and legalize his supremacy, presenting it as if he had reluctantly accepted what necessity forced upon him. The method itself was not new. Years earlier, Pompey had governed Spain as consul without ever leaving Rome, issuing orders through senatorial deputies. Octavian now employed a similar system, appointing legates to act on his behalf in the provinces. The so-called people's provinces remained under the authority of governors selected by lot from among the senators, but the contrast with the vast territories Octavian personally controlled was stark. On the surface, his position might have appeared weaker than before, since his former authority had rested on the sweeping and undefined power of universal consensus during a time of turmoil. In reality, however, he had gained far more than he had surrendered. His new supremacy rested on formal decrees of the Senate and on his regular consulship, and he could legitimately claim that his extended powers had been pressed upon him by the Senate itself. This framing explains his later assertion in the Res Gestae that he surpassed all men in influence, auctoritas, while holding no greater official power, potestas, than his colleagues. The statement was technically true, but it omitted the foundations of that influence, control of the majority of Rome's armies, unmatched wealth, and a web of loyal dependents. In addition, he had at his command the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was critical to his personal safety. The Senate's first act after his supposed renunciation of power was to double the Guard's pay, a move that underscored where real authority lay. Auctoritas sounded benign, but behind the words stood the hard realities of soldiers, money, and clients that made Octavian untouchable. Officially, Octavian remained consul, which gave him precedence in policymaking at Rome, while simultaneously ruling vast stretches of the provinces through his legates. No other magistrate could rival him. The Senate hailed this arrangement as the restoration of the Republic, but the phrase only made sense when contrasted with the excesses of the triumvirs and the long years of civil war. A genuine return to the old republican competition among aristocratic families was impossible. What emerged instead was a system that preserved the outward trappings of tradition, while granting Octavian a monopoly on real power, cloaked beneath the reassuring illusion of liberty. The Senate and people felt compelled to invent unique honors to express their gratitude toward Octavian, even if much of what they celebrated was more appearance than reality. Among the most notable was the golden Clupeus Virtutis, or shield of virtue, displayed in the Senate chamber. It proclaimed 4 qualities said to define him: valor, clemency, justice, and piety. Senators declared that countless deeds illustrated these virtues. He had avenged Julius Caesar's murder, yet after Actium he had also granted mercy to many enemies without compulsion. Still, some Romans doubted such an idealized portrait, especially when he received the civic crown, traditionally awarded to those who had saved citizens' lives. This was considered the greatest of honors, though many remembered the brutal executions he had ordered at Perugia. Nevertheless, the image of Savior was spread across the empire, with replicas of the shield displayed in various cities and coins carrying the message of "for the rescue of citizens." The greatest mark of distinction came with the granting of a new name. Octavian and his circle had debated at length what title would set him apart from all others. For a time, he considered adopting Romulus to evoke the founder of the city and present himself as its refounder. Yet the name was tainted by associations with monarchy and with the legend of Romulus's violent death at the hands of senators. In the end, a safer choice prevailed. On January 16, 27 BC, at the proposal of Munatius Plancus, the Senate bestowed upon him the name Augustus. Unlike Romulus, this designation carried a religious tone, suggesting dignity and reverence rather than kingship. From then on, he became known as Imperator Caesar Augustus. Each element of this name carried symbolic weight. Imperator linked him permanently to victory. Caesar transformed a family cognomen into the foundation of a new dynasty. And Augustus placed him in a category above ordinary men, with almost sacred connotations. Though none of these words were formal titles, their adoption reshaped Roman political language. Over time, they became markers of supreme authority, surviving in later forms such as emperor, Kaiser, and czar. Yet in his own day, Augustus was not an emperor in the later sense. Officially, he was the princeps, the first man of the state, entrusted for a decade with safeguarding the welfare of the citizens. The Principate was not a monarchy announced in a single moment, but a carefully constructed system that evolved over many years. Its slow and deliberate development made it acceptable to the Roman people, who had grown weary of violent upheavals. Augustus himself favored the maxim festina lente, make haste slowly, a principle he applied to politics as well as to life. ensuring that change came steadily enough to last. In 28 to 27 BC, the general outline of the new regime had been created, but many of its boundaries were still unclear. Politicians and citizens alike struggled to understand what conduct was now acceptable, since no written guidelines existed. The limits of behavior had to be discovered through experience, and mistakes could be costly. Some men lost their careers, others their lives, by misjudging the invisible lines of loyalty and ambition. One striking example was C. Cornelius Gallus, a poet of equestrian rank and a close confidant of Octavian. After the fall of Antony and Cleopatra, he was appointed prefect of Egypt, effectively serving as the emperor's deputy in one of Rome's richest provinces, where 3 legions were stationed. It was an extraordinary position, as governors had traditionally come from the Senate. But Gallus failed to act with the restraint his patron expected. Instead, he behaved like a monarch in his own right, tolerating or even encouraging statues and inscriptions that celebrated his deeds more than those of the man in Rome who had appointed him. His name was even inscribed on the pyramids and at the sanctuary on the island of Philippi, with only passing mention of Augustus. To Roman eyes, this display of personal glorification was unacceptable. When news reached the capital, Augustus withdrew his support. The Senate confiscated Gallus's property, and facing ruin, he committed suicide. This incident troubled Augustus, for Gallus had been among his trusted allies. If such a man could fail to understand the boundaries of the new order, what could be expected from rivals? Another warning case soon followed. Licinius Crassus, grandson of Caesar's ally, returned from Macedonia after slaying an enemy commander in single combat. He wished to dedicate the fallen leader's armor directly to Jupiter, an act that would have elevated his valor above that of Augustus himself. The attempt was blocked on technical grounds, but his ambition ended his political career. Augustus seems to have realized that Romans needed time to adapt, and he avoided making the process appear too controlled. This may explain why he left Rome in 27 BC, traveling to Gaul and then to northern Spain, where tribes such as the Cantabrians and Asturians resisted Roman authority. His campaigns there demonstrated his responsibility for pacifying the provinces under his command, while also strengthening his ties to soldiers and veterans, many of whom had been settled in Gaul and Spain, including the colony at Emerita, modern Merida. Back in Rome, meanwhile, citizens of all persuasions debated what their restored freedom truly meant. Augustus had declared that traditional institutions would continue: the Senate, the magistrates, the assemblies. Yet he himself had held the consulship every year since 31 BC Republican custom had forbidden immediate re-election. But now at least one of the 2 consulships seemed permanently reserved for him. This raised doubts among both old aristocrats and his own allies, who wondered if they were being denied the highest offices despite their loyalty. Tensions rose further when Augustus began to promote members of his family outside the traditional career path. In 25 BC, his nephew and new son-in-law, Claudius Marcellus, married to Julia, was elected aedile at only 18 and granted the extraordinary right to stand for consul 10 years before the legal age. Such privileges suggested that kinship with Augustus could outweigh merit, unsettling both friends and opponents. Whispers soon spread that Marcellus was being marked as Augustus's heir. The suspicion grew stronger during the trial of Marcus Primus, a former governor of Macedonia, who claimed he had acted on instructions not only from Augustus, but also from Marcellus. The mere suggestion that a private youth could influence the orders of a Roman proconsul was troubling. It revealed that the blending of family ties with political authority under the new order raised uneasy questions about how power was really being distributed. In 23 BC, tensions against Augustus appear to have reached a breaking point, though the exact details remain uncertain. Evidence suggests that a conspiracy emerged, possibly involving his fellow consul, Terentius Varro Murena, who left office before completing his term for reasons that are unclear, as the record of consuls is incomplete. Those implicated in the plot, some already connected to the trial of Marcus Primus, were swiftly tried, condemned, and executed, while fugitives were hunted down and killed. Murena's replacement as consul was Calpurnius Piso, a man known for his Republican sympathies after Caesar's assassination, who had lived quietly after the Republicans' defeat. Having him as a colleague was a political triumph for Augustus, signaling his willingness to work with all factions, though it also showed he had to make compromises. At the same time, the strain of navigating this fragile new system weighed heavily on him. That spring, Augustus fell gravely ill, forcing him to confront the question of succession. On his sickbed, he handed his signet ring to Agrippa, a trusted ally, but gave military and financial records to his co-consul Piso. This careful division suggested that both loyal supporters and official state officers had a role in maintaining order should he die. Crucially, he avoided naming a direct successor, which would have undermined the political framework he was still building. Augustus recovered, but the episode reshaped his approach. He abandoned his practice of holding the consulship continuously, serving only twice more in later years to introduce his adopted sons, Gaius and Lucius, into public life. Relinquishing the consulship meant he was no longer at the center of politics in Rome, but his authority over the provinces assigned to him in 27 BC remained intact. From then on, he governed them as proconsul, a fact confirmed by an edict from Hispania Citerior in 15 BC, where he explicitly styled himself proconsul. Normally, proconsuls lost their authority once they re-entered Rome, but Augustus was exempt from this restriction, keeping his imperium wherever he went. This placed him above the ordinary order, and in disputes with other governors, his authority prevailed. Even so, as proconsul, his role within Rome was limited. He could not, by that office alone, summon the Senate or popular assemblies to pass laws. To resolve this, the Senate granted him the full powers of a tribune of the people, without the title itself. These included personal inviolability and the right to protect citizens' interests, but more importantly, the power to convene the Senate whenever he wished. This new framework gave a clear legal basis to his role and provided him with the tools to direct politics in Rome. From this point onward, tribunician power became the defining symbol of his authority. It was counted annually, much like a monarch's reign, and Augustus made it a formal part of his titles, unlike his proconsulship, which was rarely emphasized. Through this combination of proconsular and tribunician powers, Augustus established a unique position that gave the appearance of legality and tradition, while ensuring that real control remained firmly in his hands. For Romans who still measured political life against the ideals of the Republic, the new order remained unsatisfying. Power that no longer depended directly on holding an office now existed alongside the traditional magistracies. Yet by stepping away from the permanent consulship, Augustus removed the clearest objection that his critics could raise. His supporters, meanwhile, took comfort in the fact that Agrippa had been given a prominent role as second-in-command. In 23 BC, Agrippa received his own proconsular authority, though limited to the east and set to expire within 5 years, ensuring that his position remained clearly subordinate to Augustus. This arrangement guaranteed that even if Augustus were suddenly to die, someone of extraordinary power would be in place to prevent renewed chaos. To further appease Republican sentiment, Augustus appointed men of their faction as consuls, a gesture that encouraged their participation in his system of government. The urban plebs, however, grew restless, believing their needs were being neglected. In 22 BC, during a grain shortage, the people pressed Augustus to assume dictatorial power, with some accusing him of engineering the crisis himself. In dramatic fashion, he tore his clothes and bared his chest, declaring he would rather be struck down by their daggers than restore the dictatorship, which had been formally abolished. Still, he took charge of Rome's food supply, following Pompey's earlier precedent, and quickly resolved the crisis. He refused the role of censor as well, but when those appointed in his place failed in their duties, it only reinforced the impression that such functions could succeed only under his guidance. Political instability continued during consular elections. Augustus, who was in Sicily and then the East, refused to stand again for consul, but disorder in Rome proved too much for even Agrippa to control. Augustus delayed his return, unwilling to disrupt sensitive negotiations with the Parthians, but when he finally came back in late 19 BC, his arrival was celebrated with extraordinary honors. Senators and magistrates went out to greet him, and an altar was raised to Fortuna Redux, with the day of his return declared a festival, the Augustalia. Such ceremonies underscored how dependent the state had become on his presence. The exact constitutional consequences of this crisis remain debated, but it is clear that Augustus acquired new rights in 19 BC associated with the consulship. His later claim to have twice conducted censuses with consular authority suggests that by this time his proconsular imperium had been extended to Rome and Italy. This change allowed him to act within the city with the same powers he already held in the provinces. He could now use the symbols of the consul's office, the curule chair, and the 12 lictors with their fasces, even in Rome itself. In practice, this placed him on equal footing with the consuls, though his real position was one of clear superiority. From this point onward, Augustus' constitutional framework had reached its essential form, the same one later emperors would inherit. The change also affected military life. Cornelius Balbus, governor of Africa, was the last commander outside the imperial family to be awarded a full triumph in 19 BC. Thereafter, generals serving as Augustus' deputies achieved victories, but their successes were officially credited to him. Even Agrippa, who might have claimed his own honors, declined triumphal processions, letting Augustus take the acclaim. Over time, this practice made it clear that victories belonged solely to the princeps. Others had to be content with honorary decorations, the ornamenta triumphalia, their statues placed in Augustus's forum as a permanent reminder of the new hierarchy. Through these gradual changes, the system evolved into one where military glory, political authority, and the visible symbols of victory all converged on Augustus, marking the completion of a new order that replaced the Republic with the Principate. In these years, Roman politics balanced on a paradox: the outward preservation of republican forms, while the unique status of the princeps became ever more apparent. In 18 BC, Augustus' 10-year mandate over his provinces came to an end, but it was extended for another 5 years, likely on the grounds that the state could not function without his leadership. At the same time, Agrippa's authority was renewed, and he too was granted tribunician powers, aligning him even more closely with Augustus. That same year, both men undertook the sensitive task of revising the role of senators, signaling their joint guardianship of Rome, though only one could stand as princeps. A year later, Augustus gave further indication of his vision for the future when he adopted his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, sons of Julia and Agrippa. By doing so, he signaled without saying outright that these boys were intended as heirs to his position, weaving the fate of his family, the Domus Augusta, into that of the Roman state itself. This connection between dynasty and empire was further underlined by the celebration of the secular games in 17 BC. Ancient Etruscan tradition held that when a full century had passed and no one alive had seen its beginning, a new age began. A comet in the sky was taken as a divine sign, a renewal of the Julian star, and Augustus seized the moment. As head of the priestly college of 15, he and Agrippa oversaw the ceremonies, which included sacrifices, games, and theatrical performances involving the entire community. Women in mourning, usually excluded, were even required to participate, marking the rebirth of the whole Roman people. Apollo, Augustus's special patron, and Diana were central to the rituals, and Horace composed a hymn in their honor, invoking protection for Rome and its ruler on the Palatine. The events were recorded on bronze and marble pillars, ensuring that future generations would remember this new beginning. Though framed as a revival of tradition, the games also displayed how far the identification of Rome with Augustus had progressed. He and Agrippa personally presented all the sacrifices, acting not as consuls, but on behalf of the Republic itself. Traditional offices continued to function. Senators minted coins, and members of the old nobility filled the consulships. Yet the imagery of coins and monuments increasingly celebrated Augustus and his achievements rather than those of individual families. Open opposition dwindled, with most dissenting senators choosing to withdraw from politics rather than resist. Meanwhile, the Senate and people endorsed Gaius and Lucius as future consuls while still boys, a sign that blood ties to the ruler now outweighed merit as the path to office. For most Romans, including many senators, the Republican past steadily lost its force. Practical life demanded adaptation to the new realities, and Augustus benefited from this shift. Even sudden changes, the deaths of Agrippa in 12 BC, Lucius in AD 2, and Gaius in AD 4, did not endanger his position. In 12 BC, after the death of Lepidus, Augustus also assumed the long-coveted role of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. The occasion drew an unprecedented crowd of citizens to vote, a reflection of the extraordinary importance attached to his person. As high priest, Augustus revived old rituals, reinstated the priesthood of Jupiter, and assumed responsibility for the Vestal Virgins, whose sacred flame symbolized the survival of the state. By housing the office of Pontifex Maximus within his own residence on the Palatine, where he also established a shrine to Vesta under Livia's care, Augustus symbolically fused his household with the very heart of the Republic. Through such acts, both practical and symbolic, the princeps strengthened the impression that the stability and survival of Rome itself were inseparable from his presence, ensuring his position at the center of Roman life and belief. The final and most symbolic honor Augustus received was the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Country. The fact that he chose to conclude the Res Gestae with this acclamation shows how much weight he placed on it. The Senate, the equestrian order, and the Roman people had long urged him to accept the distinction, and at last he consented. On February 5th, 2 BC, Marcus Valerius Messala Corvinus, who had once shared the consulship with Octavian in the decisive year 31, formally introduced the proposal in the Senate, supported by all other social groups. This recognition was not left to memory alone, but was engraved in several prominent places. In the entrance hall of Augustus' residence on the Palatine Hill, within the Senate chamber in the Forum Romanum, beneath the four-horse chariot before the Temple of Mars in his forum, and among his complete list of titles, which now reached its final form with the addition of Pater Patriae. For Augustus, it was a deeply gratifying moment. The title captured the idea that, like a father caring for his household, he had provided for Rome's safety and future through foresight and planning. He also looked to his adopted sons, already introduced to public office despite their youth, as the ones who would eventually succeed him and continue his work. Yet while Augustus may have believed he had secured both Rome's destiny and his family's future, events would not unfold in the way he anticipated. In the Res Gestae, the Senate holds a place of great importance. Augustus refers to it almost at once, recalling the decrees that admitted him to its ranks as a very young man. Decades later, when Pliny the Younger described the Emperor Trajan as one of us, he echoed something that senators in 43 BC might also have said of Octavian, though many would have hesitated to welcome him fully into their circle. He had not yet earned their confidence, nor had he attained the required age or distinction for such an honor. By 2 BC, however, when the Senate, together with the equestrian order and the people, awarded him the title Pater Patriae, he still technically remained a senator himself. Yet by then, the balance had shifted so dramatically that few of his colleagues would have dared to regard him as their equal. Even so, Augustus may well have accepted the phrase, one of us, for it matched the Roman conviction that all political life was centered on the Senate, and that true legitimacy came only from being part of it. His own rise had been forged through negotiation, conflict, and eventual consensus with this body, and his rule as princeps remained intertwined with it. Since nearly all allies and enemies alike belonged to the Senate, any account of Augustus' career is inseparable from the history of the Senate in the same period. When he surrendered his emergency powers in 28 to 27 BC, the Senate's legal authority was formally restored. Yet the political reality was different. Augustus was officially nothing more than consul, with no powers beyond those traditionally attached to that office. But as commander of most of the empire's provinces and the legions stationed there, his dominance was unmistakable. This influence was reinforced by the Senate's altered composition. Many of the great old families had disappeared in the civil wars, while others survived only through financial support from Augustus, which left them dependent on him. He himself noted in the Res Gestae the sums he had spent to sustain senators' fortunes. At the same time, new men introduced by Julius Caesar, the triumvirs, and later Augustus himself, had changed the body's character. Many hailed from Italian regions that had been excluded from politics in the Old Republic. Some descended from families that had gained citizenship only in the aftermath of the social war. Groups such as the Samnites, Peligni, and people from Etruria or Umbria began to take their places in Rome's highest assembly. Men from beyond the Apennines also entered Roman political life for the first time, owing their advancement to the leaders who had opened the way, Caesar first and then Augustus. Later, Claudius would praise Augustus for admitting the elite of every Italian community, respected and wealthy men who brought fresh vigor into the Senate. In fact, Augustus went further, drawing members from provincial elites, particularly in southern Gaul and Spain, where Roman culture had long taken root. Cornelius Balbus of Gades, the last man ever to celebrate a triumph in Rome, exemplifies this new trend. Even individuals from the Greek East, especially the province of Asia, now began to find seats in the Senate. This policy initiated a gradual transformation that, over the next 2 centuries, turned the Senate into a body representing nearly every corner of the empire, a development unimaginable in Augustus's own lifetime. The methods Augustus used to reshape the Senate were drawn from Republican tradition. Membership could be pruned through the census, and new senators entered by holding the quaestorship. He did not claim the authority to appoint senators outright, a power that would have seemed too reminiscent of Caesar's dictatorship. Still, he pursued his aims by accepted means, including reducing the Senate's bloated numbers. After Actium, its membership exceeded 1,000, far more than Sulla's limit of 600. The first reduction, in 29 to 28 BC, was relatively moderate, removing only those clearly unfit by birth or behavior and some political opponents. Yet the decisive purge came in 18 BC, when over 300 senators were forced out. Augustus had first encouraged voluntary resignation, offering to preserve honorary privileges, but few complied. A plan to have senators carry out the cuts themselves also failed. Finally, Augustus imposed the measure personally. Tensions ran so high that he entered the Senate wearing armor beneath his tunic. Through such drastic action, he reduced the body to 600 members, a number that remained the standard until the late 3rd century AD. One of the measures used to determine whether a senator was worthy of his position was his fortune and the income it produced. A minimum property qualification had existed before, set at 400,000 sesterces and applied equally to senators and knights. Augustus changed this by requiring senators to show assets of at least 1 million sesterces, thereby creating a sharp divide between the senatorial and equestrian classes. This reform was meant to give the Senate a clearer identity, but it also effectively ended the old principle that any freeborn Roman with sufficient wealth could aspire to office, enter the magistracies, and rise to the Senate. From then on, only men of senatorial rank, identified by the broad purple stripe on their tunic, could seek candidacy. Sons of senators received this rank automatically, but others had to apply for it, and Augustus seems to have had the power to grant it personally. In this way, he could decide which families would be allowed into Rome's governing elite. Formally, entry into the Senate still came through election by the people, but in practice only a small fraction of eligible voters took part. Most citizens lived too far away to travel to Rome, and many others realized that their votes mattered little, since outcomes were usually predetermined. In the first years after 27 BC, some contests were fought seriously, and again after Augustus gave up his permanent consulship in 23. But from 19 BC onward, evidence for contested elections almost disappears, most likely reflecting the growing influence of the princeps. He could control results either by deciding who was eligible to run or by openly declaring support for certain candidates, whom voters then felt compelled to endorse. Over time, some magistracies, especially the quaestorship and the tribunate of the plebs, attracted fewer candidates, since Augustus himself exercised tribunician powers every year. To keep these posts filled, knights were sometimes chosen as tribunes, and they were free to step away from senatorial life once their term ended. This made clear how much the Senate's functioning was defined by Augustus's dominance. After the deaths of his adopted sons, Lucius and Gaius, he underscored this control further. In AD 5, he established new electoral commissions of senators and knights that drew up the candidate lists. These commissions were symbolically named for the two deceased princes, making it obvious that decisions about elections ultimately rested with Augustus. The introduction of men from new families altered the Senate profoundly during his long rule. Senators now came from all over Italy, even regions with no previous history of representation, such as the Paeligni of the Central Apennines. Others came from the provinces, from Baetica in Spain, from southern Gaul, and from Asia in the east. In this, Augustus was following the path set by Julius Caesar, but he expanded it further. This did not mean, however, that the old republican houses lost all their prestige. Augustus made an effort to secure their loyalty permanently, often by arranging marriages between his relatives and members of these families. The Quinctili, to which Varus belonged, and the Domiti Ahenobarbi, ancestors of the Emperor Nero, were linked to him in this way. He also reinforced the standing of families by elevating them to patrician rank, a privilege he had held since 30 BC. Patricians were required for key priestly roles in the state religion, especially the flamens of Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, and the Salii, whose rituals were believed to safeguard the state itself. Families honored in this way gained prestige, but also became more dependent on Augustus, since their advancement came from him rather than their own achievements. As a result, all senators found themselves looking to Augustus as the center of political life. Rivalries between factions in the Senate did not vanish, but they were increasingly played out in competition for his favor rather than through open debate before the assemblies. Public confrontations gave way to quiet maneuvering under his watchful eye. Yet despite this centralization, the Senate under Augustus never became a uniform body with one shared opinion. Divisions remained, though they were contained within a system defined by the authority of the princeps. Augustus introduced further measures that reshaped the Senate's authority in ways that appeared to strengthen it, while in practice consolidating control in his own hands. Early on, he created a small advisory commission made up of himself, Agrippa, the two consuls, and a selection of magistrates and senators. The lower-ranking members rotated every 6 months, while the higher magistrates changed yearly. On the surface, this gave many senators a chance to feel important, but in reality the constant turnover reduced their influence, leaving Augustus and Agrippa as the only stable figures at the center. Since the commission discussed major political issues before they reached the Senate, the broader assembly was inclined to endorse its conclusions, which usually reflected Augustus's own views. A similar effect came from changes to the consulship. From 5 BC onward, the two consuls who began their year in office were often replaced halfway through, with 2 more senators taking their place as consuls suffecti. This doubled the number of men who could claim consular prestige, which lasted for life, but cut the term of each consul in half and diminished their real power. Augustus may not have intended this outcome. It is possible he was responding to pressure from ambitious senators who wanted more opportunities to hold the office. But the long-term result was the gradual decline of the consulship's political weight, a trend that would accelerate under later emperors when terms grew even shorter. At the same time, Augustus found ways to present the Senate as more powerful in appearance. One example was the expansion of its judicial role, especially in trials concerning serious political offenses or cases involving senators themselves. The scandal surrounding his daughter Julia in 2 BC, which implicated several young senators from prominent families, provided a clear case. Augustus might have dealt with it privately, but instead he referred it to the Senate. The body condemned Julia's associates and delivered judgments that aligned with Augustus' wishes, while the poet Ovid, somehow entangled in the affair, was banished to the Black Sea. By handling such matters, the Senate gained the role of a court for political crimes, though in practice it never operated independently of the princeps' influence. Underlying all of these policies was Augustus's constant aim, to secure his position and that of his family without appearing to dismantle republican traditions. He avoided openly stripping the Senate of authority, but ensured that real decision-making remained tied to himself. At the same time, he maintained the tradition that the most powerful posts, both in Rome and in the provinces, were filled by senators. The only significant exception was the prefecture of Egypt, created in 30 BC, where an equestrian commanded the legions. Elsewhere, equestrian prefects were assigned only subordinate roles, administering small regions under the authority of senatorial governors. Legionary commands also went to senators of praetorian rank, ensuring that military power, like political power, stayed firmly in senatorial hands. This continuity mattered greatly, for Augustus' closest allies and generals were themselves senators, and any drastic change to their status would have alienated them. By allowing senators to retain their traditional military and political authority, while at the same time centralizing the mechanisms of power around his own person, Augustus built a system that appeared to preserve republican norms, but in reality made the Senate dependent on him. In summary, during Augustus' reign, nearly all men who held power in politics, the army, or administration were members of the Senate, just as in Republican times. On the surface, this seemed to guarantee that the Senate would remain the core of Roman political life. Yet in practice, the opposite unfolded. After the late 20s BC, the Senate increasingly lost its role as the source of new initiatives. Policy no longer arose from within its chambers because the fierce competition among senators for leadership had largely disappeared. No longer did rival statesmen contend openly for dominance, attempting to implement their own visions. Instead, Augustus stood alone at the center, and the rest of the senators aligned themselves around him. Those who had lived through the final decades of the Republic could remember when the Senate was an active and assertive body. But they also remembered the bitter cost of its divisions, civil wars, bloodshed, and destruction. Many of these men were weary and unwilling to continue the struggle. As time moved on, fewer senators had first-hand experience of a republic without a princeps. The idea of politics without Augustus at the head became unthinkable for both senators and the wider public. By the year AD 20, only a few years after Augustus's death, the Senate casually referred to Tiberius as princeps noster, our leader, recognizing him not only as head of the state, but also of their own body. Even in Augustus's final years, most senators would likely have spoken of him in the same way, accepting his position as the natural and permanent center of authority. The political structure established in 28 to 27 BC also shaped how the vast Roman Empire was governed. Augustus, committed to maintaining continuity with the Republican past and ensuring a smooth transition, avoided drastic changes in administrative organization. There was no immediate need to overhaul the system, and in the early years, he made no comprehensive plan for reforming the empire's administration. Innovations came gradually, usually as responses to problems that exposed the limits of traditional practices. While the political transformation was rapid and far-reaching, the evolution of administrative structures was much slower. This gradualism was most evident in Rome itself, where the immense size of the city, with a population well over 500,000, created daily challenges. Fires, crime, and floods of the Tiber were persistent dangers, but the most pressing concern was securing a stable food supply. Earlier leaders, such as Pompey, had shown that this was possible, but after his death, the system faltered. During the triumviral period, there were shortages, and in 22 BC, another crisis forced Augustus to assume direct responsibility for feeding the population. Using his personal wealth, he distributed grain and appointed senators to supervise its distribution, yet there was still no permanent structure for maintaining supplies from abroad. It was not until AD 8, after a prolonged famine combined with military unrest along the Danube, that Augustus created the office of Praefectus Annoni, an equestrian official charged with securing Rome's imports, especially grain. This post, though modest at first, would eventually become one of the most powerful in the empire. Fire prevention developed in a similar way. Around 21 BC, Augustus tested the idea of a small firefighting unit composed of 600 slaves, originally suggested by the aedile Ignatius Rufus. This force proved inadequate, and in AD 6, Augustus established a permanent fire brigade of 7 cohorts, each made up of 500 to 1,000 men, with responsibility divided across Rome's 14 districts. An equestrian prefect oversaw this corps, as the role was considered inappropriate for senators. This unit endured for centuries as Rome's main protection against fire. Other aspects of city administration followed the same pattern. After Agrippa had privately maintained the aqueducts, Augustus in 12 BC appointed 3 senators to oversee the water supply officially. Later, 5 more senators were tasked with caring for public buildings and temples, and also with managing disputes over public land. Toward the end of Augustus' reign, the position of city prefect was formalized. This magistrate was responsible for maintaining public order, dealing with crimes committed by freedmen and lower social classes, and commanding 3 cohorts that acted as Rome's police. At this stage, the Praetorian Guard did not serve as the city's security force. They were stationed mostly in towns across Italy, only later becoming a visible presence in Rome under Tiberius. In contrast, Italy outside Rome saw almost no administrative reform. Its roughly 400 towns and cities were expected to handle their own affairs, with little intervention from the central government. Although Augustus divided the peninsula into 11 regions for purposes such as land registration and census taking, these divisions had no permanent officials or governing role. Roman tradition dictated that such responsibilities belonged to the magistrates of Rome, particularly the praetors. Thus, while Augustus transformed Rome's political life, much of Italy continued under long-established practices with minimal central interference. The only area within Italy where Augustus felt compelled to intervene directly was in the system of long-distance communication. To preserve his dominance in politics and military affairs, he required swift and reliable access to news from across the empire, and that depended on an effective road network. Once his authority was firmly established, he invested heavily in repairing old roads and constructing new ones. At first, he followed the Republican tradition of sponsoring individual projects and encouraging prominent senators to use their military spoils to extend the road system. But when this proved unsuccessful, he assumed full responsibility himself. In 20 BC, he formally took control of road maintenance, transferring funds through the state treasury rather than paying directly to maintain a republican facade. He also created a board of senators, the curatores viarum, charged with overseeing road conditions, though they had to rely on local officials and contractors to carry out the actual work. These initiatives provided the infrastructure that allowed information and people to move quickly across Italy and into the provinces, to the north, west, and east. Augustus also developed a relay system of stations where travelers could rest, change horses, or switch vehicles. Within Italy, this system was supervised by the Praefectus Vehiculorum, an experienced officer from the army. Yet the state did not supply horses or carriages. Local magistrates were required to provide them, and users were expected to pay fixed fees. Inevitably, abuse was possible, as powerful officials often demanded more resources than regulations permitted. But Augustus tried to ensure that such burdens were not perceived as hidden taxation. He understood that after decades of civil war, the population could not bear excessive demands, and his policies reflected a desire to protect Italians and provincials from unnecessary strain. Despite these measures, neither Italy nor the provinces were transformed into a fully integrated administrative system. In the provinces, the republican framework largely survived. Senators, chosen by lot, continued to govern the provinces officially assigned to the Roman people. They usually served for a year, though terms could be extended, and by the early 1st century AD, the number of such provinces stabilized at 10. In law, these proconsuls remained independent, retaining military authority, though by Augustus's later years, Africa was the only such province with a legion permanently stationed there. All other provinces fell under Augustus's direct authority after 27 BC, and from 23 BC onward, he exercised control as proconsul. Since he could not personally administer every territory, eventually numbering around 13, he appointed senators as his deputies, known as legati Augusti pro praetore. Their title made clear both their authority and their subordination to him. Unlike proconsuls, who managed taxation with the help of quaestors, legates lacked this responsibility, since Augustus did not assign quaestors to his provinces. Instead, he relied on procurators, his personal agents, often equestrians, who collected taxes and handled financial matters. Initially, some procurators were even his freedmen, such as the infamous Licinus in Gaul. But because their role increasingly resembled that of magistrates, and they were seen by provincials as representatives of Augustus himself, he later restricted these posts to men of equestrian rank. Their staffs, however, continued to be drawn from his freedmen and slaves. Through these arrangements, Augustus maintained the appearance of continuity with republican tradition, while in practice centralizing authority in his own hands. The balance between senatorial proconsuls and imperial legates created a dual system. But the reality was that the empire's most important provinces and its armies were firmly under Augustus' control. This redistribution of authority over taxation is often described as a major achievement of Augustus's rule, since it appeared to put an end to the abuses of the republican system, where tax collection was handled by private contractors who enriched themselves at the expense of the provinces. Some later historians even presented it as an early example of a modern system, with taxes gathered directly by state officials. Yet, in reality, the situation was more complex. Neither quaestors nor procurators had the administrative machinery or personnel to levy taxes directly on local populations. The collection of revenues usually remained in the hands of municipal magistrates, or, in some cases, private agents at the town or tribal level. Augustus was not in a position to abandon this long-standing arrangement, nor did he have reason to replace it. What truly changed was the diminished role of the powerful tax-collecting corporations. In the late Republic, these companies had grown so wealthy that they could sway elections and influence the decisions of Rome's leaders. Under Augustus, their independence was sharply reduced. Many went out of business, while others adapted by lowering their profits to levels less likely to provoke unrest among provincial communities. The difference was that now the emperor stood as the universal patron of the empire, someone whose responsibility it was to protect the welfare of all subject peoples. He would not allow entire regions to be destabilized for the sake of private profiteering. A similar restraint was imposed on senatorial governors. Even though they technically held independent authority in their provinces, Augustus' influence was strong enough that if disputes arose, the grievances of a city or province were likely to outweigh his loyalty to an individual senator. In this way, His oversight provided a form of protection against the worst forms of exploitation. For provincials, this amounted to a noticeable improvement in their situation, giving them the impression that the administration itself had been transformed. To modern eyes as well, this sense of a more just and orderly system seems a genuine mark of progress. During Augustus's reign, laws and state programs began to shape the lives of individuals and communities in ways never before seen in Roman history. Both citizens and provincials felt the effects of these policies. Augustus himself highlighted this in the Res Gestae, where he often referred to reforms that touched private and public life alike. One central question of the time was who could still be counted as part of the Roman people, the populus Romanus. Since no census had been conducted since 70 to 69 BC, the official count had long remained at 910,000. In 28 BC, under Octavian's direction, a new census recorded over 4 million citizens, and this figure continued to rise, reaching nearly 5 million by the end of his life. The sharp increase in numbers cannot be explained by natural growth alone. Rather, it reflected deliberate measures by the state to expand and regulate citizenship. Augustus himself pointed to his legislative program as a key factor. In the Res Gestae, he claimed that by introducing new laws, he had revived ancient practices and passed them on to future generations. Among these laws, 3 in particular stood out. One outlawing adultery, Lex Julia de Adulteris, another requiring members of the upper orders to marry, Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, and a later revision known as the Lex Papia Popea of AD 9. He also exempted himself from the restrictions, despite having only one daughter, declaring himself legally freed from the laws. This exemption allowed him to receive numerous inheritances that would otherwise have been prohibited, a striking case of the ruler excusing himself from the very system he had imposed on others. The combination of incentives and penalties explains why Augustus's marriage legislation, though widely resented, was not met with universal opposition. In the Senate, the laws sparked fierce debate, while members of the equestrian order repeatedly staged demonstrations against them. Public discontent often reached Augustus directly in the theater, which served as a space for communication between ruler and audience. His attempts to justify the measures with historical examples and appeals to moral virtue failed to persuade his critics, yet he refused to repeal the laws. Instead, he softened some of their harsher provisions while pressing ahead, supported by many citizens who valued the social discipline they introduced. Senators in particular saw merit in the regulations, especially those that reinforced their social distinction. Many agreed that marriages between senators and freedwomen, or between their daughters and freedmen, were inappropriate, as such unions undermined the dignity of the Senate. The purpose was less about excluding freedmen and freedwomen altogether, indeed, the laws encouraged their marriage, than about safeguarding the prestige of Rome's ruling class. In this sense, the legislation aimed above all at reinforcing a social order while also serving demographic objectives, as reflected in the census figures. Similar concerns guided Augustus' approach to the freeing of slaves. He clearly sought to slow the pace of emancipation, which had reached extraordinary levels in earlier times. 2 laws were introduced with this purpose: the Lex Fufia Caninia of AD 2 and the Lex Aelia Sentia of AD 4. The first addressed the widespread practice of freeing large numbers of slaves through wills. Under the new rules, the proportion of slaves who could be emancipated was restricted according to the size of the household. Half if the owner had up to 10, a third if between 11 and 30, a quarter if up to 100, and no more than 1/5 if over that number, with an absolute maximum of 100. These limits targeted the immense testamentary emancipations that had sometimes involved hundreds or even thousands of slaves, which in practice diminished the wealth left to heirs, since slaves were a vital part of family estates. Augustus's restrictions sought to protect patrimonial wealth and preserve stability. The lex alia sentia went further by imposing controls on living owners and their slaves. Only Roman citizens over 20 were permitted to free slaves, and even then they had to follow a prescribed process. Slaves themselves had to be at least 30 years old to qualify for citizenship upon manumission. Otherwise, they became members of the Latini, a status short of full Roman citizenship. Moreover, slaves deemed to have behaved contrary to Roman values were barred entirely from the citizen body. These measures reveal Augustus's determination to regulate carefully the growth of the citizen population and to prevent indiscriminate expansion. Despite Suetonius's later claim that Augustus aimed to preserve the purity of Roman blood, the evidence suggests otherwise. In the provinces, Augustus was pragmatic in granting citizenship to foreigners when political advantage was at stake. He followed the precedent of Julius Caesar, who had been notably generous in this regard, to the point of attracting ridicule from his soldiers. It is often difficult to distinguish whether certain individuals received citizenship under Caesar or Augustus, since both new citizens typically adopted the name Gaius Julius alongside their original one. What is clear is that both leaders saw political utility in extending citizenship, whether to men like Seleucus of Rhosus, a ship captain from Syria, or to Germanic chiefs such as Arminius and Segestes, who along with their families were drawn into Rome's orbit. In such cases, loyalty was the immediate goal, while cultural assimilation was expected to take much longer. Ethnic purity played no role in these decisions. Citizenship was extended as a tool of political strategy and control. In the case of Arminius and other Germanic leaders, Augustus' policy of granting citizenship and forging personal bonds ended in disappointment. Yet elsewhere, the approach often succeeded, binding individuals and communities more closely to Rome and to Augustus himself. Over time, the Roman people came to include not only the inhabitants of Rome and Italy, but also provincials integrated into this expanding political body. Much like Caesar before him, Augustus pursued an energetic program of establishing Roman colonies across the empire, many of them intended for military veterans who could no longer be settled in Italy after 30 BC. In the Res Gestae, he proudly recorded that he founded such colonies in Africa, Sicily, Macedonia, both provinces of Spain, Achaia, Asia, Syria, Gallia Narbonensis, and Pisidia. Among the most notable were Emerita, modern Merida, and Barcino, Barcelona, in Spain, Forum Iuli, Frejus, and Arausio, Orange, in southern Gaul, Salonai, Split, in Dalmatia, Dyrrachium, Dures, in Illyria, Philippi, in Macedonia, Alexandria Troas, and Antiochia Pisidia, in Asia Minor, Berytus, Beirut, in Syria, Knossos, in Crete, Sirta, Constantine, in North Africa, and Tingis, Tangier, in Mauritania. Although veterans themselves were not expected to remain long as active settlers, their children and grandchildren created lasting communities that linked Rome with provincial life and provided future recruits for the legions. Augustus also reinforced Roman presence by upgrading existing towns into municipalities, extending citizenship to their populations, and turning them into hubs of administration and Roman culture. These colonies and municipalities, modeled architecturally and institutionally on Rome itself, became the means by which the empire could govern vast and diverse territories. Urban centers were Rome's only tested method of imposing structure on conquered lands, and under Augustus the founding of such cities reached a scale greater than at any other time. This strategy was particularly important in the Germanic regions along the Rhine. The local tribes had only recently come under Roman control, and their scattered or temporary settlements made administration difficult. Roman officials saw the need for permanent centers where they could interact with tribal elites and exert cultural influence. Urban life with Roman-style infrastructure, architecture, and economy was expected to attract local populations. Soon after the deployment of legions to the Rhine frontier, Rome began to plant settlements west of the river. At Noviomagus, Nijmegen, among the Batavi, and at the Oppidum Ubiorum, later Cologne, among the Ubii, towns were built with roads, public buildings, monumental tombs, and a functioning monetary system. While Roman soldiers, craftsmen, and merchants were present, most of the population was drawn from the surrounding tribes, and over time, the Germanic element became dominant. Beyond the Rhine, in territories annexed only a generation earlier, Rome pursued a similar policy. At Waldgirmis, north of modern Frankfurt, a small but carefully planned settlement was laid out between the conquest of the region and the disaster of AD 9. Its grid of colonnaded streets, piped water supply, and forum complex with basilica echoed the urban forms of Italy. In the central square stood equestrian statues, almost certainly of Augustus and members of his family, projecting an unmistakable message. These towns were intended as visible models of Roman political order and cultural life, designed to reshape the daily existence of new subjects and tie them into the framework of the empire. The same principle could be applied on a wider scale across entire provinces. One of the most effective instruments was the cult of loyalty, first developed in the eastern regions such as Asia and Pontus Bithynia. As early as 29 BC, Octavian allowed the establishment of a cult that honored both his person and the goddess Roma, a symbolic representation of Rome's authority. Each year, representatives from the provincial cities gathered in assembly, where ceremonies were held under the direction of an annually elected priest. The focus was initially on Augustus himself, though soon his family was included as well. A central feature of this cult was the oath of loyalty, renewed every year and binding on all the inhabitants of the province. This model, first tested in the East, was later introduced in the West. In 12 BC, Drusus, Augustus's younger stepson, summoned the leading men of the Gallic tribes to Lugdunum, modern Lyon. There, sacrifices and festive games were performed at the Ara Romae et Augusti, the altar dedicated to Rome and Augustus, signifying loyalty to the ruler of the world and to Rome's interests in the 3 Gallic provinces. The ceremony was repeated annually, and the renewed oaths of loyalty were intended to reinforce ties to Rome and to secure the allegiance of the provincial elites in particular. A similar system was planned for Germania, where tribes from both sides of the Rhine were to assemble each year at a designated site. The chosen location eventually became the Oppidum Ubiorum, an urban settlement founded around the altar of Rome and Augustus. Yet in Germany, especially east of the Rhine, this model failed to produce the intended effect. In AD 9, during the Great Uprising led by Arminius, Segimundus of the Cherushi, who had been selected as priest of the annual ceremonies, dramatically tore off his priestly insignia and joined the rebellion. This act symbolized the rejection of Rome's attempts to integrate the Germanic tribes through religious loyalty. Still, the failure in Germania did not diminish the broader success of the policy elsewhere. Through a combination of measures, expanding the citizen body, founding urban colonies, spreading the imperial cult, and encouraging integration, Augustus gave the Romanization of the empire a powerful and lasting momentum. Once set in motion, the process was irreversible, no matter how much resistance appeared in individual regions. Augustus opens the Res Gestae with a striking declaration. At the age of 19, by my own decision and at my own expense, I raised an army with which I freed the republic oppressed by the tyranny of a faction. In these words, he left no doubt about the foundation of his power: the army. The Roman Republic would not have collapsed without the decisive role the military came to play in domestic politics. Once rival leaders began to split apart, their legions divided with them, turning the army into a collection of partisan forces. Only after the victory at Actium was Rome reunited under a single command, transforming the divided legions into the unified Roman army once again. Augustus understood that his authority rested on ending the civil wars and ensuring that the army would remain loyal. Reviving the old republican system of annual levies was unthinkable, as it would have undermined his own supremacy. Instead, he became the true founder of a permanent standing army. The decisive question then was its size. At Actium, the opposing sides together commanded more than 60 legions, not including auxiliary forces supplied by allied kings and subject tribes. The burden of all these troops fell upon the victor. Many soldiers expected retirement after years of service, and so Augustus dissolved entire legions to bring the army down to a number he considered sustainable. On what exact grounds these calculations were made is unknown, though Agrippa likely had great influence. Ultimately, Augustus retained 26 legions, adding 2 more later after Galatia became a province. This number of 28 legions remained stable for the rest of his reign. In addition, smaller auxiliary cohorts were formed, usually of 500 men, often recruited directly from newly subdued peoples such as the Asturians of Spain, the Brutians of Pannonia, and the tribes of Raetia north of the Alps. The effect was twofold: weakening resistance by removing fighting men from their homelands, while strengthening Rome's forces. Regular contingents also came from long-standing allies like the Batavians and the Ubii, who supplied troops under treaty obligations. Though technically outside the Roman army, they fought under Roman commanders and were paid in Roman currency, as shown by the coins found at military sites like Beckinghausen on the Lippe River. The total strength of the armed forces is difficult to calculate. The 28 legions alone represented about 170,000 men, but the number of auxiliaries is less certain. We know that at least 80 auxiliary units participated in the Pannonian uprisings between AD 6 and 9. Even so, relative to the vast empire, the numbers were modest. Yet the financial weight was staggering. A legionary earned 900 sesterces a year, and while this seems modest, it meant a base outlay of more than 140 million sesterces annually. In reality, the cost was far higher, since cavalry and officers were much better paid, and further expenses included equipment, construction of camps, fleets in both Italy and the provinces, as well as the Praetorian Guard and urban cohorts, who received greater pay than ordinary soldiers. Discharge bonuses were another enormous expense. From around AD 5, legionaries received 12,000 sesterces on retirement, while Praetorians received 20,000. The annual cost of such payments must have been at least 50 million sesterces, perhaps much more. Augustus often used his personal wealth to fund exceptional needs, especially for veteran settlements. He claimed to have spent 600 million sesterces in Italy and 260 million in the provinces to buy land for veterans, a practice he contrasted with Sulla, and his own earlier confiscations. Still, it would be wrong to imagine he personally financed the army's daily costs. Most expenses were covered by the state treasury, into which revenues from taxes and tributes officially flowed. Yet as soon as discharge bonuses were converted from land into cash, liquidity became a pressing problem. Soldiers had to feel certain that their promised rewards would be delivered. Otherwise, the dangerous unrest of the late Republic would return. At first, Augustus bridged the gap with personal funds, but this was unsustainable. The solution came in AD 6, during a severe financial crisis. Augustus introduced a new system to guarantee veterans' rewards, creating a special military treasury, aerarium militare. To fund it, he imposed a 5% inheritance tax, vicesima hereditatium, exempting small family legacies but taxing the larger bequests that wealthy Romans traditionally distributed to friends and clients. To reassure property owners that the money served a worthy purpose, he made the fund explicitly for veterans, while soldiers' regular pay continued to come from the main treasury. Augustus himself gave the first contribution of 170 million sesterces. A gesture meant not only to establish the fund, but also to show the troops that their ruler personally guaranteed their future. In the Res Gestae, he made certain to highlight this contribution, underscoring both his generosity and his role as protector of the army. Augustus required the soldiers themselves to share part of the financial burden for supporting veterans. At first, he set the length of service at 12 years for praetorians and 16 for legionaries, which was shorter than before, and he left these terms unchanged for about 2 decades. But in AD 5, when he was trying to stabilize the finances of the system, he extended the periods again to 16 and 20 years. Even then, full discharge was not granted immediately. Veterans were expected to remain in a reserve capacity for several more years, available for emergencies. By the time of Augustus' death in AD 14, resentment had built up, particularly among the troops on the Lower Rhine and in Dalmatia, where mutinies broke out. The soldiers claimed that after serving 30 or 40 years, they were still not free to go home, but forced to remain under arms in special units. Some of these grievances were exaggerated, yet they reflected real frustrations. Much of this dissatisfaction arose because men did not fully understand why discharges were delayed, mainly the shortage of funds to pay out the promised bonuses. Just as senators disliked paying the inheritance tax, soldiers resented the burden placed upon them through extended service. Still, Augustus tried to strike a balance. He sought to meet soldiers' expectations by ensuring that their service had a clear endpoint and that their rewards were reliable. This was one reason mutinies remained rare during his reign. In one notable instance, in 19 BC, troops in Spain who had lived through the civil wars mutinied. Agrippa responded by dismissing them dishonorably, which meant they received no bounty at all. Politically, this carried little risk, since Augustus had no rivals left who could exploit the unrest as in earlier times. It is important to note that Augustus wasn't technically the supreme commander of the entire Roman army. Legally, proconsuls of the Senate's provinces retained independent command over the forces stationed there. Tiberius later reminded one such proconsul in Africa that, as governor, he had full authority to distribute military decorations without seeking approval from the princeps. This shows that in theory, the independence of senatorial governors remained intact. Augustus's authority over them came not from legal reform, but from the political subordination of the Senate. His imperium could, however, override theirs if disputes arose or in cases of military crisis, and on occasion, the Senate passed special decrees placing a proconsul under his command. as happened with Cornelius Lentulus in Africa. The traditional right of victorious proconsuls to celebrate triumphs was never formally abolished, but in practice it faded away. Instead, Augustus took public credit for major victories while allowing successful commanders to receive triumphal insignia as substitutes. Their names and achievements were honored with bronze statues in the Forum of Augustus, linking their glory directly with his. In practice, then, Augustus held effective control over nearly the whole army. In most provinces, the legions were formally under his command after Macedonia lost its troops, and Illyricum came under his legates. He personally appointed the legates and legion commanders, whose authority derived from his imperium. Officers and men alike knew that their careers and fortunes depended on him. Annual oaths of loyalty were sworn directly to Augustus, reinforcing this bond. Tribunes and centurions, who benefited from generous pay and opportunities for advancement, became especially loyal. Although the wars in Spain, the Balkans, and Germany demanded enormous sacrifices and inflicted heavy casualties, Augustus inspired a sense of pride in the soldiers who fought for him. Inscriptions on tombstones and monuments celebrated the honors he granted and the victories won under his leadership. Each award was not only a recognition of individual service, but also a reminder that the triumphs of Rome were the triumphs of Caesar Augustus. Augustus was determined that his name would always be linked with victory. One of the 4 official virtues attributed to him by the Senate in 27 BC was virtus, meaning courage and military excellence, and he reinforced this association by adopting imperator, victorious commander, as his praenomen. His titles included a count of how many times he had been hailed as imperator by his troops on the battlefield. By AD 13, this recognition had been given to him 21 times, a figure that showed how often he might have entered Rome in a triumphal procession had he chosen to do so. No Roman before him had been so frequently acclaimed, nor had anyone else declined triumphal honors so many times. Entire sections of the Res Gestae highlight his military achievements and the honors he gained. Yet, alongside this martial image, Augustus also stressed that he had brought peace to the Roman world, a peace that would be remembered as the Pax Augusta. The most famous monument to this claim was the Ara Pacis Augustae, the altar of Augustan peace, decreed by the Senate in 13 BC upon his return from campaigns in Spain and Gaul. He also took pride in having closed the gates of the shrine of Janus Quirinus 3 times, something that was supposed to happen only when Rome was at peace everywhere. Before his reign, it had happened only twice. In truth, this peace applied largely within the empire, for beyond its borders, Augustus waged more wars than any of his predecessors, and although Rome suffered losses, it also gained more territory in his reign than in any similar span of time. Under Augustus, Rome expanded into northern Spain, the Alpine regions of Rhaetia and Noricum, Illyricum and Pannonia, and the lands north of Macedonia as far as the Danube. In Asia Minor, parts of Pontus, Paphlagonia, Galatia, and Cilicia were added, while Judea was annexed to Syria after the removal of its ruler Archelaus in AD 6. Egypt had already been taken into Roman control in 30 BC, and Africa's provincial borders were extended both eastward and southward. Thus, in nearly every direction around the Mediterranean, Rome's sphere of power grew. Some of this expansion occurred without major campaigns, as when Galatia was made a province after the death of King Amyntas, or when Judea was reorganized under a Roman prefect following unrest. But in most cases, conquests came through military campaigns in the Republican tradition. though Augustus had the advantage of directing the resources of the entire empire and shaping long-term strategies across decades of stable rule. The Roman elite generally welcomed this expansionist approach. For centuries, they had seen it as Rome's destiny and duty to enlarge its dominion through just wars. The poet Virgil's phrase, imperium sine fine, power without limit, captured a belief widely shared among the ruling classes. Still, while most supported the idea of expansion, there was disagreement over where it should be pursued. Many thought the East should be the focus, especially because of Rome's humiliations at the hands of the Parthians, Crassus' disastrous defeat at Carrhae in 53 BC, and Antony's retreat in 36 BC. Rome longed for revenge and the recovery of the standards captured in those defeats. Julius Caesar had planned a campaign against Parthia before his assassination, but Augustus chose not to follow this path. The reasons remain unclear, though distance, the memory of earlier defeats, and the risks of fighting such a formidable power may have influenced his decision. Instead of launching a large invasion, Augustus used diplomacy and the support of client kings to secure the eastern frontier, backed by a strong Roman army stationed in Syria. In 20 BC, negotiations conducted by his stepson Tiberius achieved the return of the lost standards. This diplomatic success was celebrated at home in the style of a great military victory. The Senate erected an arch in the Forum Romanum, showing Augustus in a triumphal chariot, and the recovered standards were placed in the temple of Mars Ultor, the Avenger, in the Forum of Augustus. That temple became the symbolic center for military rituals, decisions about war and peace, and displays of victorious commanders. The famous statue of Augustus from Prima Porta, whose breastplate depicts a Parthian returning the standards, demonstrates how powerfully this event was presented as a triumph. While diplomacy preserved the eastern frontier, the real battlefields were in the west, especially along the Rhine and the Danube. Here, Rome fought repeated wars of conquest, suffered setbacks, and gained new lands, sometimes losing them again. Yet the balance overall tilted in Rome's favor, allowing Augustus to claim that he had not only secured peace, but also expanded Roman power to a degree unmatched by his predecessors. Not long after completing the key steps of restoring the Republic in 27 BC, Augustus traveled to Spain. For nearly a decade, the regions of Asturia and Cantabria in the north had resisted Roman control, and although some governors celebrated triumphs in Rome, no one had succeeded in fully subduing the tribes. It is doubtful that the unrest was grave enough to demand Augustus's personal involvement. More likely, after reorganizing political life at home, he wished to demonstrate his care for the provinces. A massive force of at least 7 legions was deployed in the north, and while Augustus quickly proclaimed victory over the Cantabrians, the fighting dragged on until 19 BC, when Agrippa took command. The conquered lands were added to the provinces of Baetica and Hispania Tarraconensis, both already under Augustus's authority, ensuring his direct oversight. A major prize of this campaign was the rich mineral resources of northwestern Spain, whose profits were soon directed to finance further wars of expansion. When the conflict in Spain ended, many of the legions were shifted to Gaul, where their labor was needed to build new roads. Agrippa oversaw the extension of routes from Lugdunum, modern Lyon, to the Rhine and the English Channel. Interest in the lands beyond the Rhine was becoming clear, shown by these roadworks, the building of a camp at Dangstetten, and the resettlement of the Ubian tribe around 19 to 18 BC. The Ubians were moved from their old homeland near the river Lahn to the fertile Cologne Basin, where coin finds dating from about 20 to 10 BC confirm their new settlement. Their role was to act as allies and a protective buffer against raids by other Germanic groups. The evidence suggests that Augustus and Agrippa were already considering offensive action east of the Rhine. When in 16 BC Roman forces under Marcus Lollius were badly defeated by the Sugambri, Usipetes, and Tencteri, even losing a legion's eagle standard, the disaster did not inspire new plans, but rather strengthened the determination to carry out a large-scale conquest. That same year, Augustus annexed the kingdom of Noricum in the eastern Alps, adding it to the province of Pannonia under the rule of a knightly prefect subordinate to the senatorial governor of Illyricum. Shortly after, his stepsons Tiberius and Drusus advanced westward and secured the adjoining Alpine territories, which later became Raetia. For the first time, Italy was no longer bordered by independent tribal lands, but was encircled by Roman-controlled regions. The achievement was celebrated widely. Horace commemorated the victories in his poetry, and the Senate soon erected the Tropaeum Alpium, a monumental trophy near modern Monaco, to glorify Rome's triumph over the Alpine peoples. The conquest of Noricum and Raetia cannot be separated from the twin offensives launched in 12 BC, when Drusus campaigned against the Germans east of the Rhine, and Tiberius led operations in Illyricum. These campaigns may have aimed to secure the frontiers by neutralizing neighboring tribes before they could rise in rebellion. Agrippa would have commanded in Illyricum, but his sudden death left the task to Tiberius, who over 4 years subdued most of the Illyrian and Pannonian tribes. Resistance was weak and disorganized, but Rome later underestimated the tribes' resolve, leading to a major uprising 15 years later. Meanwhile, Drusus advanced rapidly in Germania, establishing permanent camps such as Oberaden and Beckinghausen on the river Lippe, proof that his goal went beyond mere raids. He launched successive expeditions northward and then eastward, reaching the Elbe by 9 BC after subduing many tribes. Excavations at Hedemunden on the Werra River, dating to this campaign, show the extent of Roman presence. But shortly after this achievement, Drusus suffered a fatal fall from his horse. Tiberius hurried to Germania to assume command, and by 8 BC, according to Velleius Paterculus, he had brought much of the region to the brink of becoming a tribute-paying province. Although the historian Velleius Paterculus, who had served under Tiberius, praised his former commander, his claim that Germania was nearly subdued was not far from reality. The Romans reinforced their control by leaving behind imposing military bases and settlements, which signaled their determination to stay. Camp Hultern on the Lippe was constructed on such a massive scale that it resembled a fortified town, while Waldgirmes in the Lahn Valley was planned from the outset as a civilian settlement, complete with stone buildings, a forum, and statues of Augustus's family. Had Roman rule endured longer, more such centers would surely have appeared. Augustus was so certain of success that he seized local lead mines and leased them out, attracting investors who clearly shared his confidence in Rome's conquest. By 7 BC, Germania was formally considered a Roman province, as shown by the establishment of a provincial cult for Roma and Augustus at the Oppidum Ubiorum, the settlement that later became Cologne. The withdrawal of Tiberius to Rhodes in 6 BC did not cause a shift in Roman policy toward Germania, though some rebellions did occur. Despite gaps in the record, it is clear that Roman control held until Tiberius returned to the Rhine in AD 5. At that time, the greatest concern was King Marbod of the Marcomanni, who had settled in Bohemia and built a powerful alliance network among the tribes. Roman leaders feared he might incite unrest among communities already under their rule. Tiberius prepared a large campaign against him, with major bases at Mainz and Carnuntum. A vast camp was even constructed at Marktbreit on the Main, though it was never put to use. 12 legions were mobilized, but before the campaign began, news of a major uprising in Pannonia forced Tiberius to redirect his forces, leaving Marbod undefeated. The revolt in Pannonia was of unprecedented scale. For once the tribes had united, and the danger to Roman authority was so severe that Augustus stationed guards in Rome itself. Extraordinary measures were taken. New auxiliary forces were raised, slaves were freed to serve, and even Roman citizens, including some in the capital, were conscripted. In the end, Tiberius commanded 10 legions and at least 80 auxiliary units, with which he eventually suppressed the rebellion in AD 9, though both sides suffered catastrophic losses. The triumph he received could not conceal the fact that Rome's military and financial reserves were left deeply strained. Almost immediately after news of this victory, however, Rome was shaken by an even greater disaster. Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania, took his own life after 3 Roman legions, and 9 auxiliary units were annihilated east of the Rhine. The revolt was led by Arminius, a young prince of the Cherusci who had once served in the Roman army, held Roman citizenship, and commanded an auxiliary unit of his tribesmen. Rome had expected his loyalty in return for these honors, and indeed, some tribes wanted to remain faithful. But the leaders of the revolt demanded unity against Roman rule, and their call was answered by large numbers of people. Debate remains over whether the rebellion began among Germanic auxiliaries familiar with Roman tactics, or whether it was a broader uprising, but the wide tribal support proved decisive. Varus had placed too much trust in Arminius, ignoring warnings from Arminius' uncle Segestes. Later, Romans blamed Varus himself for the catastrophe, accusing him of provoking discontent by treating Germania as if it were already a Roman province, imposing taxes and administering justice. Yet at the time, such actions were within his authority, for Germania was indeed regarded as a province of the empire. In the late summer of AD 9, reports of unrest among a Germanic tribe persuaded Varus to lead the campaign that ended in his death and the annihilation of his forces. Arminius and his allies exploited the poor weather and their knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect. Tacitus later described the scene of the disaster as the Saltus Teutoburgiensis, though the modern Teutoburg forest only received its name centuries later, when his writings were rediscovered. Excavations near Kalkreis, north of Osnabrück, have uncovered fittings from numerous wagons, weapons, and military gear scattered over several kilometers, along with collapsed ramparts and buried hoards of coins, pointing strongly to the destruction of Varus's army there. Yet this was no single battlefield. The fighting extended over a wide area for 3 days. Varus and senior officers took their own lives, while the rest of the army, left leaderless, was slaughtered or captured. News of the disaster caused near panic in Rome. Many feared the Germanic tribes would surge across the Rhine into Gaul, but no united attack followed. Arminius even sent Varus's severed head to King Marbod, seeking an alliance, but Marbod refused. Though the frontier remained tense, it held. Some have suggested that this catastrophe forced Augustus to abandon his expansionist aims in Germania. In reality, he reinforced the Rhine frontier with fresh legions, replacing the destroyed units and even increasing the overall strength. Tiberius was dispatched to conduct punitive expeditions, while Germanicus, son of Drusus, assumed command in AD 13. That same year, Germanicus won a victory for which Augustus accepted his final military acclamation, suggesting that he had ordered his stepson to reclaim lost ground. Excavations at Waldgirmis reveal efforts to rebuild settlements destroyed in AD 9, and several tribes along the North Sea, including the Frisians, remained loyal to Rome. Thus, Augustus could still truthfully claim in the Res Gestae to have pacified Spain, Gaul, and Germania from Cadiz to the Elbe, even if the wording was broad. The true retreat from expansion beyond the Rhine came later, under Tiberius, after Germanicus's campaigns between AD 14 and 16 failed to secure lasting success. Elsewhere, Augustus stretched Rome's resources to their limits with offensives that did not always achieve their objectives. Not long after Egypt became a Roman province, its prefects Aelius Gallus and C. Petronius were sent to campaign in Nubia and Arabia between 25 and 22 BC. Augustus proudly recorded that his forces had marched further south than any Roman army before, a claim meant to flatter Roman pride, though no permanent gains were secured. Similarly, despite the diplomatic achievement of recovering lost standards from the Parthians in 20 BC, the eastern frontier remained unstable. Some 2 decades later, Julius Caesar, Augustus's adopted son, was dispatched to stabilize the border but failed, and a wound received in battle ultimately cost him his life. His death was not only a political setback, but a devastating personal blow for Augustus. Despite these failures and the staggering losses in Germania and along the Danube, Romans remembered Augustus above all as the great conqueror who had expanded their empire more than any leader before him. The territories he added elsewhere remained part of Rome for centuries, serving as enduring proof to his contemporaries that his policies had been fundamentally sound. Few rulers after Augustus gained such direct familiarity with the empire he governed. Only Hadrian would later surpass him in the range of his travels. Even before he gained supreme authority, Octavian had visited parts of Italy, Greece, Illyricum, and Sicily, and following Actium, he spent time in many eastern provinces. Between 21 and 19 BC, he journeyed east once more while Tiberius dealt with Parthian diplomacy, yet it was in the western provinces, particularly Spain and Gaul, that he spent most of his time. Between 27 and 24 BC, and again from 16 to 13 BC, he governed from there, returning once more to Gaul in 27 BC, 11 to 10 BC, and in 8 BC. These journeys revealed a feature that became characteristic of imperial rule. Wherever the emperor was, there the center of the empire shifted. Envoys from distant Indian rulers sought him at Tarraco in 25 BC, and representatives of Queen Candace of Ethiopia came to him at Samos in 20 BC. The Senate, too, often dispatched delegations to meet him in remote places. Political life and decision-making followed Augustus, even though Rome itself remained the heart of power. Unlike Antony, whom his enemies accused of wanting to move the empire's center to the east, Augustus never considered abandoning Rome. On the contrary, he made it the visual and symbolic heart of the empire through a new language of architecture that displayed the power of monarchy while maintaining a careful respect for republican traditions. One telling example of this balance was his restraint in not constructing a royal palace, despite the many Eastern models he knew well, such as the palaces of the Ptolemies or Herod the Great. The lavish imperial complex that dominates the Palatine Hill today was the work of his successors. Augustus instead lived in a relatively modest house on the Palatine, purchased while he was still triumvir. The site itself was loaded with symbolism. for it was said to be where Romulus had founded Rome. The dwelling was modest in comparison to the extravagant homes of other late Republican leaders, though over time it acquired important symbolic features. When the new political order was established in 28 to 27 BC, the Senate ordered laurel trees to be planted at its entrance and the civic crown placed above its door, making it appear more like a sacred temple than a private home. After he was chosen Pontifex Maximus in 12 BC, Augustus declined to live in the traditional priestly residence, the Regia in the Forum, and instead converted part of his Palatine house into public space. He added a shrine to Vesta, where his wife Livia took on the symbolic role of guarding the flame once tended by the Vestal virgins. This blending of private life and public duty was made even more striking by the addition of a temple to Apollo, erected on a spot within his property that lightning had marked as sacred. Built entirely of white Carrara marble, the first of its kind in Rome, it later housed the Sibylline books and became a focal point of the secular games. The complex also contained a library and a portico, transforming his residence into a space where political, religious, and cultural life converged. As Augustus grew older, the Senate itself gathered more frequently within these walls, following not only his physical presence, but also the shifting ideological center of Roman politics, now firmly bound to the Palatine Hill. Augustus reshaped the Forum Romanum, long the symbolic core of Republican Rome, into a space that reflected his family and his vision for the new order. While some projects were decreed and funded in part by the Senate, it was unmistakably the image of the princeps and his dynasty that dominated the transformation. Over time, the Forum became less a stage of Republican politics and more a monument to the Julian house. The first great addition was the Temple of the deified Julius, erected on the eastern side to mark Caesar's funeral pyre. After Actium, a new speaker's platform decorated with the prows of captured ships was placed before it, standing opposite the older Republican rostra and symbolizing the triumph of a new era. Nearby rose the Parthian arch, crowned with the recovered standards, and a statue of Augustus, while the Temple of Castor and Pollux was rebuilt entirely in marble under the names of Tiberius and Drusus. Beside it stood the Basilica Julia, dedicated to Augustus' adopted sons Gaius and Lucius. Even the Curia, the Senate's meeting house, was rebuilt, renamed the Curia Julia, and given a new orientation towards the Forum. Among these Augustan monuments, only the Basilica Aemilia remained independent, restored by the family that had first built it centuries earlier. Even the repaving of the Forum floor, though technically a senatorial project, did little to counterbalance the overwhelming visual and symbolic dominance of Augustan structures. To the north of this transformed Republican space, Augustus added his own Forum, directly connected to Caesar's. On land he personally owned, and funded from the spoils of war, he constructed the Forum Augustum with its great Temple of Mars altar, promised decades earlier before the Battle of Philippi. The complex combined practical functions with a deliberate architectural message. At its heart, Mars and Venus, ancestors of Rome and the Julian line, appeared in the pediment, linking Augustus to both divine and heroic beginnings. The surrounding porticos displayed two parallel galleries of statues. On one side, figures from Rome's history, from Romulus through great statesmen and generals like Appius Claudius, Sulla, and Pompey, were honored with inscriptions recounting their deeds. On the other, the genealogy of the Julian family unfolded, from Aeneas through Augustus' kin, ending with Marcellus and Drusus. Both lines converged in the figure of Augustus himself, shone in triumph at the center of the piazza, praised as father of the nation. The imagery presented him as both the heir of Roman greatness and the paternal guardian of the state. The princeps building projects stretched well beyond these two monumental centers. His own account lists temples across the city that he either built or restored, among them the Capitoline Temple and sanctuaries on the Quirinal and Aventine Hills. In 28 BC alone, he claimed to have overseen the rebuilding of 82 temples that had fallen into neglect during decades of civil war. By restoring Rome's sacred sites on such a scale, Augustus framed himself not only as a restorer of the Republic, but as a second founder of the city itself, reviving its religion, its identity, and its claim to eternal greatness. In the Res Gestae, Augustus lists surprisingly few secular structures. Beyond the Curia, he highlights his restoration of the Theatre of Pompey, the construction of the Theatre of Marcellus in memory of his son-in-law, and his work on Rome's aqueducts, which he either repaired or expanded. The majority of practical building projects, however, fell to Agrippa. Despite already holding consular rank in 33 BC, Agrippa once again served as aedile to secure official authority for his construction program, though he paid for much of it from his own wealth. Even after his magistracy ended, he continued to oversee new works for the city's needs. 2 new aqueducts, the Aqua Virgo and the Aqua Iulia, significantly increased the capital's water supply. The Aqua Virgo supplied Agrippa's baths on the Campus Martius and the fountains of its park. Close by stood the Pantheon, whose vestibule displayed statues of Augustus and Agrippa, while the interior housed images of the gods, including one of the deified Julius Caesar. The Pantheon thus symbolically joined the human and divine realms, though without fully merging them. Agrippa also completed the vast Scepta Iulia, begun by Julius Caesar as a space for assemblies and vote counting. Its immense marble-clad structure, while grand, soon lost its intended political purpose. Instead, Romans used it as a place to stroll and socialize, a welcome amenity in a city notorious for its cramped housing. Equally important were markets and storage facilities, such as the Macellum Liviae on the Esquiline Hill, named for Augustus' wife, which provided a practical service to the city's residents. Over the course of just 4 decades, Rome's appearance was utterly reshaped, mirroring the transformation of its political life. Marble monuments rose across the city, nearly all linked to Augustus, his family, or his closest associates. Inscriptions bearing their names adorned temples, arches, and obelisks, often in gleaming bronze letters that broadcast the achievements of the princeps to all who passed. Statues of Augustus were placed everywhere, on the rostra in the Forum, before the Temple of Mars altar, in the Pantheon's portico, and even in the small shrines built between 12 and 7 BC in each of Rome's 265 districts. These chapels, dedicated primarily to the Lares, the guardian spirits of each neighborhood, also contained statuettes of Augustus' genius, his vital spirit, which he himself provided. Sacrifices to the local deities thus also honored him directly. Through such measures, Augustus made his presence unavoidable in Rome's public life. The visual and symbolic message grew steadily clearer. He was no longer simply princeps, the first among equals, but the single ruler of Rome. The more he and his family occupied public space, the more muted became the visibility of the old aristocracy. The senatorial elite did not vanish, but their ability to leave a lasting mark on the city was curtailed. Cornelius Balbus was the last aristocrat to finance a major public building, his theater paid for with spoils from Africa, and also the last man outside the imperial family to celebrate a triumph. After the early years of Augustus' rule, provincial cities and clients could no longer honor senators with statues in public squares. Only the Senate retained that privilege, and even then, any such honors were granted under the watchful gaze of Augustus. Public space had become the dominion of the princeps, while the senators were left to express their identity within the confines of their private homes. Although Augustus ruled alone, there was never an Emperor Augustus in the sense later generations would imagine. His contemporaries lacked a single term that could fully describe his position, for no word existed that combined his legal authority, his political power, and the reality of his dominance within the still republican system. Only in hindsight was the label emperor retroactively applied to him, a description that distorts the complex nature of his role. His authority rested on several pillars: the formal powers delegated by Senate and people, his vast personal wealth, and the extensive patronage networks he built throughout the empire. Together, these formed the basis of his auctoritas, which he himself stressed as the foundation of his actions, though modern scholars have sometimes accepted his presentation too literally. This authority, being a collection of powers and privileges granted by others, could not simply be handed down like a throne. Augustus never tried to seize dictatorial control in a single step. Instead, he carefully constructed his dominance in a way that preserved the facade of republican tradition, ensuring that Senate and people appeared to retain the right to choose their leader. His skill lay in persuading these bodies to cooperate while never openly breaking the ideological framework of a restored republic. He could not legally transfer his position, but he was determined that it would not vanish with his death. Like any Roman noble, he wished his power, wealth, and influence to remain in his family, which in practice meant the continuation of monarchical leadership under the guise of republican forms. From early in his rule, Augustus worked to secure a successor, though without declaring it outright. His difficulty was that he had no son to inherit his position in the traditional Roman manner. His only child was Julia, born in 39 BC to his second wife, Scribonia. Her life was shaped entirely by her father's political calculations, and these ambitions ultimately led to her downfall. Outwardly, she lived in splendor, but her personal wishes counted for little. While campaigning in Spain between 26 and 24 BC, Augustus arranged her marriage to his young nephew, Marcellus, the son of his sister Octavia. The alliance was so urgent that the wedding was held in Augustus's absence, with Agrippa acting as proxy. As the princeps's son-in-law, Marcellus immediately rose to prominence. His influence is revealed in the trial of Marcus Primus, a former governor of Macedonia, around 23 BC. Accused of conducting an unauthorized campaign beyond his province, Primus defended himself by claiming that both Augustus and Marcellus had instructed him to act. Whether or not this was true is less important than the perception it shows. People believed Marcellus had the authority to give military orders simply because he was Augustus's closest male relative. It is clear that Augustus intended him to play a decisive role in the future. Yet this plan collapsed when Marcellus died later that same year, cutting short what might have been the first clear dynastic succession of the new regime. Before Marcellus's untimely death, Augustus was careful not to give the impression that succession would rest solely on his personal will. In 23 BC, when he himself became gravely ill, speculation grew that Marcellus had been designated in his will as heir. The rumors persisted strongly enough that Augustus eventually had the document read aloud in the Senate to dispel the claims. This step was likely meant less for the public than for his own circle, especially Agrippa, his most trusted associate. After Marcellus died, it was Agrippa who assumed that central role, further strengthened by marriage into the family. Augustus arranged for Agrippa to divorce his wife and marry Julia, his daughter. Agrippa was granted proconsular authority in 23 BC, and 5 years later, he received tribunician power, placing him on nearly equal footing with Augustus in legal terms, though not in status. Julia bore Agrippa 2 sons in 20 BC and 17 BC, and Augustus formally adopted them both, making his grandsons legally his sons. In the Res Gestae, he refers to Gaius and Lucius Caesar as such, leaving little doubt that the intention was for them to succeed him one day. The adoption was transparent in its purpose, though Augustus was careful not to appear as if he were openly overturning republican traditions. With Agrippa still alive and powerful, there was no conflict of interests, since he was both father of the boys and a man with enough authority to act as Augustus's immediate successor, if needed. For a moment, it seemed as though Augustus had crafted a secure 2-generation solution to the succession question. That plan collapsed in 12 BC with Agrippa's sudden death, leaving Gaius and Lucius far too young to exercise any real power. Augustus, pragmatic as ever, turned once again to his closest family. Livia, whom he had married years earlier, had 2 sons from her previous marriage, Tiberius and Drusus. She naturally sought advancement for them, and her influence was likely decisive when Augustus reconsidered his plans. Drusus was already married to Antonia, Augustus's niece, so the focus shifted to Tiberius. At the time, he was married to Vipsania, Agrippa's daughter by a previous wife, but he was compelled to set her aside and marry Julia once her mourning for Agrippa ended. The marriage was politically expedient, but personally disastrous. Tiberius accepted, probably under pressure, and their temperaments proved ill-matched. Some suggest he hoped for the political rewards that might follow, but Augustus treated him with far greater caution than he had Agrippa. Tiberius won military acclaim in Pannonia and Germania and shared in Augustus's acclamations as imperator. In 7 BC, during his second consulship, he was even granted a triumph, the first in years. It was not until 6 BC, however, that Augustus had the Senate bestow on him tribunician power, a sign that he might be intended as heir. By then, it was too late. That same year, Tiberius abruptly withdrew from politics, left Rome, and settled on Rhodes as if in self-imposed exile. The reasons remain uncertain, though his troubled marriage to Julia seems central. Stories of her affairs circulated widely, though whether they were true or malicious gossip cannot now be determined. Tiberius's withdrawal from politics was made even more difficult by the growing prominence of Augustus's adopted sons, Gaius and Lucius, who in 6 BC were only in their early teens. Augustus made every effort to present them as his chosen heirs. He organized public games in their honor and admitted them to priestly colleges while still young. In 8 BC, he had taken Gaius to Gaul to introduce him to the army, where soldiers received an extra bonus in his name, further strengthening ties of loyalty. At that time, the legions on the Rhine were under Tiberius's command, making the contrast even sharper. The favoritism became clearer after Tiberius retired to Rhodes. In 5 BC, Augustus resumed the consulship to add prestige to the moment when Gaius reached manhood and donned the toga of an adult citizen. The Senate immediately gave Gaius the right to take part in its sessions and scheduled him to become consul within 5 years, at the age of 20. Only Augustus himself had reached that office at such a young age. Gaius was also hailed as Princeps Juventutis, leader of the youth of Rome, a symbolic parallel to Augustus's own role as leader of the Senate. Across the empire, the message was understood. Inscriptions from Spain and Asia Minor show that oaths of loyalty to Augustus were extended to include Gaius and Lucius as well. In 2 BC, when Lucius came of age, he too received the same honors, and Augustus seemed to have secured the dynasty through both grandsons, provided he lived long enough to prepare them for leadership. Training began quickly. In 1 BC, Gaius was dispatched east to handle delicate negotiations with Parthia and oversee Armenia, later being acclaimed imperator after taking Artagira. Lucius was meant to gain similar military experience in Spain, but he died suddenly at Massilia in AD 2. Just 2 years later, Gaius, weakened by a wound, died in Lycia on his way home. Both were buried in Augustus's mausoleum, and Rome mourned deeply, showering honors on the young men who had once embodied the future. With their deaths, Augustus's carefully constructed plan collapsed. He had resisted for years Livia's urgings on behalf of her son Tiberius, but now necessity forced his hand. Their relationship was strained. Augustus had compelled Tiberius to divorce Julia, and after her scandal, their family bond had weakened further. Yet the princeps had no alternative. He recalled Tiberius to Rome and began negotiating the terms of succession. Augustus was still determined to impose his own vision, even in matters of family. Though Tiberius had a son, Drusus, Augustus insisted that he adopt Germanicus, the son of his late brother Drusus and Antonia, who was Augustus's niece. This demand reflected Augustus's obsession with blood ties to his own line. Tiberius reluctantly agreed, formally adopting Germanicus in AD 4. Immediately afterward, Augustus himself adopted Tiberius, binding him by law as his son and making clear that he would carry on the leadership of Rome. In the same year, Tiberius was entrusted with all the powers required to govern the state. He was granted both tribunician authority and proconsular command, which placed him on a footing similar to Augustus. From that time forward, every military acclamation of Augustus was extended to include Tiberius, and in AD 13 he celebrated his second triumph. Foreign rulers, who once paid homage to Gaius and Lucius Caesar, were now directed to recognize Tiberius, a clear acknowledgement of his elevated position. Later that same year, he was given an imperium equal to that of Augustus, allowing him to exercise command across all provinces and over the legions stationed there. By then, Tiberius almost certainly knew that Augustus had formally named him as his principal heir in the will he signed on April 3, AD 13. Both the public transfer of authority and the private inheritance had been legally secured in preparation for the princeps' death. As Augustus entered his final year, he also reviewed and completed the text of the Res Gestae, the record of his achievements that he had been compiling for years. By the summer of AD 14, the work was finished. Though many of his hopes had been tested and some of his plans undone, Augustus could still look back with satisfaction on a life that had shaped Rome and fulfilled his vision. Augustus lived much of his life under the shadow of fragile health, and thoughts of death were never far from his mind. Fully aware that he might die suddenly and young, he took careful steps to ensure stability after his passing and to prevent any dangerous vacuum of power. Among his preparations was the construction of his own tomb. Work began on the great mausoleum on the Campus Martius as early as 32 BC, even before the conflict with Antony had been decided. The choice of location sent a clear message. Unlike Antony, who was accused of looking toward Alexandria as a new center of power, Octavian wished to root his life and death firmly in Rome. By the time the structure was finished, around 28 BC, Octavian had no rivals left, and the mausoleum instead came to symbolize his dynasty and its claim to authority. It was the largest tomb ever seen in Rome, a vast circular structure over 290 feet across and about 150 feet high, dominating the northern campus Martius. Surrounded by parks of evergreens, its white travertine walls stood out in solemn brilliance. Marcellus, Augustus's young son-in-law, was the first to be buried there, followed by Agrippa, Gaius, Lucius, and others who predeceased the princeps. Inscriptions were added over time to honor the dead of the imperial family. 2 obelisks from Egypt were erected on the forecourt around 11 BC, and after Augustus' death, bronze pillars displaying the res gestae were set by the entrance, ensuring that his achievements would be read by all visitors. The setting of the mausoleum was part of a larger program of monumental symbolism. Nearby stood the Ara Pacis, voted by the Senate in 13 BC to celebrate the return of Augustus from Gaul. To the south stretched a monumental sundial, its gnomon an Egyptian obelisk. On the autumn equinox, the date of Augustus' birthday, the shadow of the obelisk fell directly upon the entrance to the altar, a cosmic sign that his life and destiny had been aligned with peace and divine order. His birth, victories, and eventual death were thus bound together in an architectural statement that presented him as chosen by fate to restore harmony to the world. By AD 13, Augustus's strength was failing. He relied increasingly on a council of senators to handle affairs of state, while Tiberius was formally given powers equal to his own, ensuring a smooth transition. In the summer of AD 14, after accompanying Tiberius part of the way to Illyricum, he traveled on to Nola in Campania, where his father had once died. There, on August 19th, Augustus passed away, with Livia and Tiberius at his side. Thanks to his foresight, the transfer of power took place without unrest, and Tiberius assumed leadership without opposition. The funeral was a grand public event, carefully staged according to his own instructions. Business in Rome ceased as enormous crowds from across Italy and the provinces gathered. From the Palatine, his body was carried on a golden bier to the Forum, where Tiberius and his son Drusus delivered solemn orations. The procession then moved to the Campus Martius, where his coffin, crowned by a wax image, was placed on the pyre. As the flames rose, an eagle was seen flying upward, a sign that Augustus's soul had ascended to the gods. The Senate quickly declared him a divinity, creating a new priesthood, the Sodales Augustales, to maintain his cult, and began work on a temple in his honor. His ashes were placed in a marble urn at the heart of the mausoleum, beneath a towering statue of himself as guardian of the restored republic. From that moment, Augustus was enshrined not only as Rome's ruler, but as one of its gods. His name, adopted by all his successors, soon ceased to be personal and became a title of authority. The reign that bore his stamp set the foundations of the empire for centuries to come. Even though later rulers adapted and reshaped his system, the essential framework had been laid in his lifetime. What followed was built on the legacy of Augustus, whose combination of political vision, symbolism, and control shaped an entire era of Roman history. If we count his rule from the victory at Actium, Augustus governed for 45 years, longer than any other ruler of Rome. Yet the course of this long reign is not always easy to trace, since most surviving accounts were written much later and often blur the distinction between early developments and later outcomes. As a result, his rule can appear strangely motionless, as if frozen in time, just like his portraits, which consistently show him with the same youthful features, never as an aging man. His leadership was never free from controversy, even though open criticism largely disappeared after the late 20s BC. Tacitus, in his Annals, has both supporters and opponents speak at Augustus's funeral. But even there, most of the reproaches focus on the years of the triumvirate. He was accused of ruthlessness, deceit, and an unrelenting desire for power, charges not without foundation. Still, even his harshest detractors could not dismiss his accomplishments. He reshaped the Republic into a new political order, secured a lasting settlement for the provinces, and established a degree of peace across much of the empire. None of those who followed him as emperor could claim an achievement of equal scope, and few statesmen in later centuries could be measured against the standard he set.